They arrive from the sea, a tide of hungry ghosts with no name. On the grand stone walls of his mortuary temple at Medine Habu, the pharaoh Ramesses III has them carved for eternity. A chaotic jumble of ox carts piled high with families, warriors in horned helmets and feathered headdresses, their ships a swarm of locusts on the horizon. The Egyptian scribes, dipping their reed brushes in black ink, can only give them a generic, fearful title, the Sea Peoples. They are the nameless enemy, the great mystery at the end of an age. Their arrival coincides with a world in flames, with mighty empires turning to dust and great cities to silent ruins. They are the final, crashing chord of a symphony that had played for 2,000 years, an era defined not by stone or by iron, but by a beautiful, terrible alloy that changed what it meant to be human. We are going to journey back, long before these mysterious invaders, to the very beginning of that age, to understand the world they so violently unmade. We are going to tell the story of the Bronze Age. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel so inclined, let us all know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet thrill to see how this little corner of history spans the globe. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a flicker of greenish light in a campfire, a subtle secret held within a peculiar kind of stone. For millennia upon millennia, humanity's relationship with the earth was one of surfaces. We worked with what we could find, what we could break, and what we could shape: wood, bone, and above all, stone. The Neolithic, the New Stone Age, was the apex of this relationship. A skilled napper could strike a piece of flint with practiced perfect force, shearing off a flake with an edge sharper than any surgeon's scalpel today. With these stone tools, our ancestors cleared forests, harvested grains, and built the first permanent settlements, those tight clusters of mud brick houses we spoke of before. It was a world of immense ingenuity, but it was also a world of frustrating limits. A flint axe was a masterpiece of controlled fracture, but it was also brittle. If you struck a rock the wrong way, or dropped it from a height, it shattered, and the hours of work invested in it were lost forever. It could not be repaired, only replaced. This was the fundamental rule of the material world. Things broke and stayed broken. But humans are curious creatures, drawn to anything that shines. Here and there, amongst the dull browns and grays of everyday rock, they found something special. Nuggets of a soft, reddish gold metal lying in riverbeds, or veins of it running through other stones like threads of sunset. This was copper. In its native form, it was beautiful but, well, a little disappointing. You could hammer it into a flat sheet for an ornament, or a thin wire to wrap around a handle, but you couldn't give it a lasting edge. A hammered copper axe head would look regal, but it would bend and dull after just a few chops into a sturdy oak. It was a decorative metal, a bauble for the wealthy, not a serious replacement for the hard, reliable edge of good flint or obsidian. Some cultures, in a period we now call the Chalcolithic or Copper Age, got very good at working it, even learning that if you heated the metal, a process called annealing, you could hammer it into more complex shapes before it became brittle. They were standing on the very edge of a new reality, peering into the fire, but not yet seeing the full picture. The great mystery is why it took so long for the next step to happen. For thousands of years, people knew about copper and its frustrating softness. The solution, it turns out, was hiding in plain sight in another, far less impressive-looking metal. Tin is copper's opposite. It's a soft, silvery gray metal, not particularly eye-catching. Its ore, cassiterite, is a dark, heavy stone that doesn't scream its potential. It's also significantly rarer than copper, found only in specific scattered locations across the ancient world. On their own, copper and tin were second-rate materials for the serious business of tools. One was too soft, the other even softer. But when brought together in the searing heat of a charcoal furnace, something magical occurred. This is the moment our story truly pivots. We will never know the name of the first person to witness it, or where their kiln glowed under a canopy of prehistoric stars. Perhaps it was a complete accident, a batch of copper ore contaminated with cassiterite, shoveled into the fire without a second thought. The smith would have expected the familiar, reddish glow of molten copper. But as the impurities burned away and the crucible tipped, what poured out would have been different. It would have flowed more easily, a liquid gold filling the stone mold, and as it cooled, it would have settled into something new. Not the soft, reddish-brown of copper, but a harder, brighter, more golden metal. This new material was bronze. The simple act of adding a small amount of tin, perhaps just 1 part in 10, transformed the copper into a substance greater than the sum of its parts. It was an alloy, the first artificial material of consequence ever created by human hands. The smith who pulled that first bronze axe head from its mold would have felt the difference instantly. It was heavier, more substantial. When struck against a stone, it rang with a clear musical note, not the dull thud of copper. And when he took it to the grinding stone to sharpen it, he would have discovered its true secret. It held an edge, a hard, durable, wicked edge that could be honed to near razor sharpness. This was not a mere ornament. This was a weapon. This was a tool that could fell a tree in half the time of the finest stone axe. And here was the greatest trick of all. If it did break, if the axe head snapped under a powerful blow, its life wasn't over. Unlike the shattered flint, the broken pieces could be gathered up, thrown back into the crucible, melted down, and cast again, reborn and as perfect as the day it was first made. The fundamental rule of the material world had been broken. Things could now be unbroken. A revolution had begun, not in a king's court or a battlefield, but in the smoky, sweltering heat of a craftsman's workshop. The knowledge of this secret recipe, this perfect ratio of copper to tin, would become the most valuable technology on the planet, a secret that would build empires and then, ultimately, help tear them all down. That secret recipe, the one that turned soft copper into the stuff of legends, came with a rather serious complication. A recipe is useless without its ingredients, and the ingredients for bronze were not conveniently located next to each other on a cosmic shelf. The earth had hidden them in different places, separating them by formidable mountains and vast, sun-scorched deserts, as if to test the resolve of the humans who so desperately wanted to unlock their power. This geological inconvenience would spark the first true international age. A web of commerce and competition spun not from a desire for exotic luxuries, but from the urgent foundational need to acquire the two building blocks of power, copper and tin. One was difficult to get, the other was maddeningly elusive. The entire Bronze Age, from its first gleaming daggers to its final chaotic collapse, would be shaped by the immense efforts of solving this simple yet profound supply problem. First, there was copper. Its green-streaked ores, malachite and azurite, were more common and visually striking, often found staining cliff faces or weathering out of rock formations. The earliest miners likely just scratched these surface deposits, but as the demand for bronze grew from a trickle to a flood, they had to follow the veins of ore deep into the earth. The mines they dug were not the grand, engineered tunnels of later ages. They were cramped, terrifying holes in the ground, places of deep darkness and profound danger. Picture a man, or more likely a child, wriggling into a fissure in the rock so narrow that his shoulders scrape the sides. His only light is the sputtering flame of a small clay lamp burning animal fat, casting frantic shadows that dance and leap across the claustrophobic walls. His only tools are a heavy stone hammer, a sharpened antler for a pick, and a shovel made from the shoulder blade of an ox. He works for hours in the stale, dust-choked air, his world reduced to the rhythmic, deafening crack of stone on stone, chipping away at the precious green rock. To get at the ore, miners would sometimes light fires against the rock face, then douse the heated stone with water, causing it to crack and splinter from the thermal shock. It was a brutal, effective technique that also filled the tunnels with smoke and steam. Rockfalls were a constant threat, the groaning earth a reminder that it could swallow them at any moment. Once chipped away, the heavy ore had to be hauled to the surface in leather bags, a back-breaking ascent through the darkness. And the work wasn't over. This rock had to be crushed into a coarse powder, a task often done by women and children, their hands stained green from the dust. Then came the smelting. In shallow pits lined with clay, the crushed ore was layered with charcoal and set ablaze. To reach the melting point of copper, over 100 degrees Celsius, the fires had to be fed with a constant stream of air, likely forced through clay pipes or tuyères by teams of workers using blowpipes or primitive bellows. It was hellishly hot, exhausting work, a mesmerizing and dangerous dance with fire that after hours of sweat and toil would yield a small pool of glowing, liquid copper at the bottom of the furnace, a hard-won treasure ready for the next step. This immense effort produced the primary ingredient, but copper alone, as we know, was not enough. The real challenge, the engine that drove the vast expansion of the Bronze Age world, was the quest for tin. Tin is the shy, retiring partner in the alloy. Its ore, cassiterite, is an unimpressive dark stone, and its geological deposits are exceptionally rare. While the ancient Near East had several viable sources of copper in places like Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Sinai Peninsula, it had virtually no tin of its own. This presented the world's first major resource crisis. A local chieftain could control a copper mine, but he couldn't make bronze without that crucial 10% of tin. And the people who had the tin lived very, very far away. Archaeologists still debate the exact sources, piecing the story together from chemical signatures in millennia-old artifacts. Some of the earliest tin may have come from the nearby Taurus Mountains in modern-day Turkey, or perhaps the Zagros Mountains of Iran. But the richest and most sought-after deposits were located in a place that must have seemed like the edge of the known world, modern-day Afghanistan. Imagine the journey. A trader organizes a caravan, loading up sturdy donkeys, not with spices or fine textiles, but with something far more valuable, perhaps silver or high-quality woolen cloth from the cities of Mesopotamia. He then sets out on a journey of hundreds, if not thousands, of miles. He must navigate treacherous mountain passes, cross barren deserts, and negotiate passage with dozens of different tribes, each with their own customs and their own demands for tribute. It was a trip that would take months, fraught with the danger of bandits, bad weather, and simple, heartbreaking misfortune. These merchants were the pioneers of globalization, connecting cultures that had never before interacted. A man mining tin in the Hindu Kush Mountains would likely never see the ocean, yet the fruit of his labor would end up in the sword of a Mycenaean warrior fighting on the shores of the Aegean. The demand for tin created a network of dependencies, a fragile but vital chain that pulled the world together. A disruption anywhere along that chain, a collapsed mine in Afghanistan, a bandit attack in Iran, a political dispute in Syria, could cause a bronze shortage in Egypt or Crete. For the first time in history, the fate of one civilization was directly tied to the fortunes of another, thousands of miles away. This sprawling network, born of necessity, was the invisible skeleton that gave the Bronze Age its shape, its strength, and ultimately its greatest vulnerability. That invisible skeleton of trade routes, painstakingly built by donkey caravans and daring merchants, soon began to grow flesh and muscle. The metals that traveled those long, dangerous roads were not just commodities. They were catalysts. Once the ingots of copper and tin arrived at their destinations and were transformed by the smiths, remember, into that miraculous alloy, they began to quietly and completely reshape human life. The revolution that started in the furnace did not stay there. It spilled out into the fields, the forests, and the workshops, fundamentally altering our relationship with the landscape. Better tools meant more food, and more food meant more people. It was a simple, powerful equation that would lead, for the first time on Earth, to the rise of the city, a brand new and fantastically complex way for human beings to live together. For the Neolithic farmer, life was a constant, precarious negotiation with the land. His primary tool for breaking the earth was the aard, essentially a sharpened, fire-hardened stick, perhaps weighted with a stone, which he would drag through the soil to create a shallow furrow for his seeds. It was exhausting work, and it was only effective on the lightest, most forgiving soils, typically those found right beside the rivers. This limited the amount of land that could be cultivated, which in turn limited the food supply and kept communities small. The arrival of bronze changed the terms of this negotiation entirely. A smith could now cast a durable metal tip for that same wooden ard. This bronze plowshare could bite deeper into the earth, breaking up tougher, clay-heavy soils that had previously been impossible to farm. Suddenly, vast new tracts of land away from the immediate riverbanks became viable fields. The same transformation happened with every other task. Remember the old flint axes, so sharp yet so brittle? They were now replaced by cast bronze axe heads. A team of men with bronze axes could clear a forest for new farmland in a fraction of the time, the sharp metal biting into wood with a satisfying thud, immune to the shattering that plagued flint. For the harvest, curved bronze sickles replaced their clay or flint counterparts. They stayed sharp longer, could be resharpened easily, and allowed a harvester to gather grain with a speed and efficiency his grandfather could only have dreamed of. This wasn't just a minor upgrade, it was a complete paradigm shift. It triggered an agricultural boom, the second great farming revolution in human history. For the first time, communities could reliably produce a surplus of food, more grain, more olives, more dates than they needed for their own immediate survival. This surplus was the seed from which civilization would grow. It was the most valuable form of wealth, and it would change everything about the structure of society. With a surplus of food stored safely in a communal granary, a new and radical idea became possible. Not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. In the old world, the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of the time, were directly involved in food production. Now, a farmer who produced enough grain for 10 families could effectively trade that excess food with 9 other families in exchange for their services. This unlocked the age of the specialist. A man with a talent for pottery could now spend all day, every day at his wheel, perfecting his craft because he knew he could trade his fine pots for the bread he needed to eat. The weaver, the carpenter, the tanner, and of course the bronzesmith. These professions could now exist as full-time occupations. Society began to stratify and organize itself in new ways. Someone had to manage the granary, to record who brought in how much grain and who took what out. This required an administrator, a bureaucrat. Someone had to appeal to the gods to ensure the rains came and the harvest continued, giving rise to a formal class of priests. And someone, inevitably, had to protect the precious, life-giving surplus from outsiders, which led to the creation of the professional soldier. These new specialists, the artisans, the priests, the scribes, the warriors, tended to cluster together around the source of their security, the surplus. The central granary and the temple that sanctified it became a magnet, drawing people in from the surrounding countryside. The small, egalitarian farming villages of the late Neolithic began to swell, growing into bustling towns. These weren't just bigger villages, they were fundamentally different organisms. You would find a street where the rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the smith's hammer never ceased. Another district would be filled with the smoky haze from a dozen pottery kilns. And at the center, a monumental temple, built on a scale never before seen, reached for the sky, a testament to the community's newfound wealth and organizational power. These were the first true cities, humming with the energy of thousands of people living together in a complex, interdependent web. The city was an ecosystem of specialists, and the food surplus was the sunlight that powered it all, a process made possible by a simple, elegant piece of metal that allowed a farmer to cut a deeper line in the earth. The city and the plow, it seems, were born together, each one driving the other forward into a new and uncharted world. Nowhere did this new urban experiment explode with more creative and chaotic energy than in the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, the land cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, that abstract city we spoke of was given a name and a local habitation. It was the city of Uruk, the city of Ur, of Eridu and Lagash. This was the land of Sumer. The people who lived here, the Sumerians, are one of history's most profound mysteries. Their language is what we call an isolate, meaning it's completely unrelated to any other known language, ancient or modern. They seem to simply appear in the archaeological record around 4000 BCE, possessed of a unique culture and a restless ambition that would lay the very foundations of civilization as we know it. Whether they were migrants from some unknown land or a local culture that simply blossomed with astonishing speed, we may never know for certain. But what they built on that flat, sun-baked alluvial plain became the blueprint for the world. A Sumerian city was a marvel of human cooperation. At its heart, dominating the flat landscape for miles around, rose the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid of mud brick. This was the home of the city's patron god and the nucleus of its economy. Remember the granary and the temple we imagined as the core of the first cities? The ziggurats were that concept made monumental, a physical expression of the fusion between spiritual power and economic reality. Around it, a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets, pulsed with life, packed with the mud brick homes of the artisans, merchants, and farmers who made up the city's population. Life was noisy and communal, lived in the open air and the shared courtyards, and surrounding it all was a thick, high wall of baked brick, a stark necessity in a world of competing neighbors. For the Sumerian cities were not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of fiercely independent and intensely rivalrous city-states. They shared a common culture and religion, but they fought constantly over land, and more importantly, over water, the lifeblood that flowed through the irrigation canals they had dug with their bronze tools. To manage the breathtaking complexity of this new urban life, the Sumerians deployed an invention even more revolutionary than the bronze axe: writing. It began, as most bureaucratic innovations do, with taxes and accounting. Temple administrators needed a way to track the bushels of barley and the heads of livestock coming into the ziggurats' storehouses. At first, they used simple pictures, or pictograms, pressed into soft clay tablets, a stylized drawing of a head of grain next to a set of numerical marks. But slowly, over centuries, these simple pictures evolved into something far more flexible. The scribes began using the sharpened tip of a reed to press wedge-shaped marks into the clay, a style we call cuneiform. These wedges could represent not just objects, but sounds, the syllables of their spoken language. This was the breakthrough. Suddenly, anything that could be said could be written down. Laws, contracts, letters, medical diagnoses, religious hymns, and the first great works of literature, epic poems of heroes and gods. The clay tablet was the hard drive of their civilization, an administrative tool that allowed a king to manage a city of tens of thousands of people, and an artistic medium that allowed their culture to speak to us across 5,000 years. Of course, diplomacy and record-keeping were not always enough to settle the disputes between the rival cities. For that, the Sumerians relied on the other great pillar of their power: bronze. The professional soldier, who we saw emerge from the food surplus, was now a reality. Archaeological finds like the famous Stele of the Vultures show us exactly what these armies looked like. We see ranks of infantrymen standing shoulder to shoulder in a tight phalanx, protected by large rectangular shields. They wear pointed bronze helmets, a simple but effective defense against the mosses and slings of an earlier era, and they carry long spears, each one tipped with a leaf-shaped blade of gleaming, deadly bronze. These were the first professional armies, and their existence transformed the nature of conflict from small-scale tribal raiding into organized state-level warfare. For centuries, this was the status quo in Sumer, a delicate, violent dance of power between a dozen or so cities, none quite able to gain the upper hand for long. This bloody equilibrium was finally shattered by one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history, a man named Sargon. His story is shrouded in legend. He was said to be a commoner, a royal cupbearer who rose through the ranks, his official biography claiming he was placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the river as a baby, a story that echoes down through the millennia. Sargon was not a Sumerian. He was from a Semitic-speaking people to the north, in a region called Akkad, but he saw the potential in the Sumerian model of civilization, and he saw their fatal weakness in their disunity. With a disciplined, professional army equipped with the best bronze weapons and a keen understanding of the power of the cuneiform tablet for administration, he did what no Sumerian king had managed to do. He conquered them all. One by one, the ancient cities of Sumer fell to his Akkadian forces. Sargon then forged them into something new, the world's first empire. He standardized weights and measures, instituted a regular postal service using clay tablets, and placed loyal Akkadian governors in each city, creating a centralized state that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He had masterfully combined the two great tools of the age, the bronze spear to conquer and the clay tablet to rule. While Sargon and his successors were building their fragile, fractious empire in the land between the rivers, another civilization, far to the west, was undergoing its own profound transformation. Here, life was not dictated by the unpredictable whims of two rivers, but by the steady, benevolent pulse of one, the Nile. The civilization of Egypt was ancient even by Sumerian standards, a culture defined by a deep conservatism and an obsession with eternity, all of it made possible by the predictable annual flood that renewed the soil with life-giving black silt. For centuries, during their old kingdom, the Egyptians had achieved stunning feats of engineering with little more than copper chisels, stone hammers, and an almost fanatical level of human organization. They had built the great pyramids at Giza, monuments so vast and perfect they seemed to defy their simple origins. But this age of titanic confidence had faltered, collapsing into a century of civil war and disunity known as the First Intermediate Period. The story of the Bronze Age in Egypt, then, is not one of explosive beginnings, but of a grand rebirth, a consolidation of power by a new line of pharaohs who would cautiously, almost reluctantly, embrace the new metal to restore order and build for eternity. One of the great puzzles of the Bronze Age is why Egypt, a powerhouse of the ancient world, was so slow to adopt bronze technology on a wide scale. While Sumerian smiths were perfecting their alloys and Akkadian soldiers were marching with bronze-tipped spears, Egyptian craftsmen were still largely relying on the tools of their ancestors, hardened copper, and exquisitely knapped flint. This technological lag is a fascinating mystery with a few competing explanations. The first, and perhaps simplest, is geography. Egypt was insulated from the rest of the world in a way Mesopotamia was not. Protected by vast deserts to the east and west, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and the rocky cataracts of the Nile to the south, it was a self-contained world. The frantic trade and warfare that accelerated technological change in the Near East simply didn't penetrate this bastion as quickly. The all-important tin, remember, was nowhere to be found in Egypt or its immediate vicinity. It had to be imported over immense distances, making it a rare and fantastically expensive luxury. Another hypothesis suggests that perhaps the need was simply less urgent. The primary building material for the great monuments of the Old Kingdom was limestone, a relatively soft rock that could be effectively quarried and shaped with the copper tools the Egyptians had already mastered. Their flint knives were legendary for their sharpness. For the specific challenges they faced, their existing toolkit worked remarkably well. There might also have been a deep cultural conservatism at play. Egyptian society was built on the concept of Ma'at, a belief in a divinely ordained cosmic order, harmony, and stability. Change was often viewed with suspicion. The old ways were the best ways, the ways of the gods. It's entirely possible that a new material, a foreign technology, was seen as disruptive, something that didn't quite fit into their perfect, ordered view of the world. For a long time, bronze in Egypt remained a prestige item, used for beautiful ceremonial daggers or mirrored discs for the elite, but not for the common work of farmers and builders. This all changed with the rise of the Middle Kingdom. After a series of powerful princes from the southern city of Thebes fought to reunify the country, the new pharaohs of the 11th and 12th dynasties had a clear agenda: restore the central authority of the king, secure the nation's borders, and never again allow the country to descend into chaos. To achieve this, they finally embraced bronze as a tool of state power. The Egyptian army was reformed and re-equipped. Soldiers were now issued with deadly new bronze weapons, like the distinctive crescent-shaped epsilon axe, a design that could hack through helmets and shields, and the elegant leaf-shaped spearheads that made them more than a match for any rival force. This newly strengthened army was put to immediate use, pushing south into Nubia, a land rich in the gold that would fund the Egyptian state, and building a series of massive mud brick fortresses along the border, bristling with archers and bronze-wielding infantry. These fortresses, like the mighty citadel at Buin, were marvels of military engineering, a clear and brutal statement that the age of weakness was over. But the pharaoh's ambitions were not just military, they were also monumental. They began vast new building projects, not pyramids on the scale of Giza, but more intricate temples, chapels, and statues, often carved from the hardest stones like granite and diorite, materials that would have shredded the soft copper tools of their ancestors. In the quarries of Aswan, the rhythmic clang of hammers now had a sharper metallic ring as workers used bronze chisels and saws to cut and shape the massive blocks. These harder tools allowed for a new level of precision and detail, for inscriptions cut so crisply they seem to have been inscribed only yesterday. For the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, bronze was the instrument of consolidation. It was the metal that secured the borders, pacified the population, and allowed them to carve their legacy into the eternal stones of the Nile Valley, ensuring their names and their power would, they hoped, endure forever. As the great land empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia consolidated their power along the fertile river valleys, a completely different kind of civilization was rising from the turquoise waters of the Aegean Sea. On the long, mountainous island of Crete, a people we call the Minoans were building a society that turned its face not inward toward irrigated fields, but outward to the sea. They drew their wealth and their security from the waves, creating a vibrant, mysterious, and profoundly influential culture that would become the first great maritime power in European history. Theirs was not an empire of marching armies and fortified cities, but a network of influence held together by the swift, painted ships that sailed from their bustling harbors, an empire whose palace walls were not made of brick, but of the ever-shifting sea itself. The heart of the Minoan world was not a temple citadel or a tomb, but something altogether new, the palace. At sites like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea, the Minoans built vast, sprawling complexes that seemed to defy simple description. The Palace of Knossos, famously excavated by Arthur Evans and mythologized as the Labyrinth of King Minos, was not a single building, but a joyous, almost chaotic collection of rooms, courtyards, workshops, and shrines, all interconnected by a maze of corridors and staircases. There were no towering defensive walls like those at Ur, no imposing military architecture like the fortresses of Nubia. Instead, the palace was open and airy, built around a grand central court where public ceremonies must have taken place. Light wells and clever porticos funneled sunlight and fresh breezes deep into the structure. They even had a form of running water, with sophisticated terracotta pipes for plumbing and drainage that would not be rivaled in Europe for another 3,000 years. The walls were not bare stone, but were plastered and covered in stunningly beautiful frescoes, vibrant paintings that celebrated the natural world. Here, dolphins lap from a stylized sea, blue monkeys scamper through a field of flowers, and elegant griffins guard a throne room. It was a place of wealth and administration, certainly. Vast storerooms were filled with giant ceramic jars, or pythoi, holding oil, wine, and grain, but it felt less like a king's fortress and more like a vibrant community center, a nexus of art, religion, and commerce. This apparent lack of fortification is the key to understanding the nature of Minoan power. The prevailing theory is that the Minoans had no need for massive walls because their true defense was their navy. They created what historians call a thalassocracy, from the Greek words thalassa for sea and kratios for rule, a sea empire. From their bases on Crete, their fleets dominated the Aegean. Their ships, sleek and high-prowed, were the delivery vans and the naval patrols of their day, connecting the dots between mainland Greece, the Cycladic Islands, and the great empires of the Near East. They were the great middlemen of the Eastern Mediterranean. They would sail east to Cyprus to pick up copper ingots, perhaps trade for tin that had made its way from the far reaches of Afghanistan, and carry these precious metals back west. They traded their own exquisite pottery, fine textiles, and perhaps saffron, a priceless spice derived from the crocuses that grew on their island. In return, the gold of Egypt and the artistry of the Levant flowed back into Crete, funding the construction of their magnificent palaces and the lavish lifestyles of their elite. Minoan culture, as seen through their art, feels refreshingly different from that of their contemporaries. Where Egyptian art is formal and obsessed with the afterlife, and Mesopotamian art often glorifies warfare and kingship, Minoan art is filled with movement, nature, and a celebration of life. Women are depicted prominently in frescoes and figurines, dressed in elegant, layered skirts and open bodices, suggesting they held a high and perhaps even priestly status in society. And everywhere we see the bull. Bulls are shown in ceremonial processions. Their horns are replicated as sacred symbols, and most famously, they are the centerpiece of the terrifying and athletic ritual we call bull leaping. In this spectacle, depicted in the most famous Knossos fresco, young men and women seem to vault, handspring, and somersault over the back of a charging bull. Whether this was a religious ritual, a rite of passage, or a sport, we simply don't know, but it speaks to a daring and unique relationship with the forces of nature. An even deeper mystery, however, lies on the small clay tablets found in the palace archives. Here, the Minoans kept their records in a beautiful, flowing script known as Linear A. Despite decades of effort by the world's best linguists and codebreakers, it remains undeciphered. The voices of the Minoans, their language, their history, their thoughts, they are still silent, locked away in a script we cannot read. The end of this brilliant civilization came suddenly and violently. Around 1600 BCE, the nearby volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history. It was a cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The eruption would have triggered colossal tsunamis, which may have smashed the Minoan fleet in its harbors and obliterated their coastal towns. It would have ejected billions of tons of ash into the atmosphere, blanketing eastern Crete in a thick, toxic layer, choking crops and poisoning pasture land. For a seafaring people who worship the power of nature, such an event must have felt like the apocalypse, a sign that the gods themselves had turned against them. For many years, this was seen as the definitive cause of the Minoan collapse. More recent archaeology, however, suggests a more complicated story. While Thera was certainly a devastating blow, the final destruction of the great palaces seems to have happened a century or two later, and the culprits may have been human. A new, more militaristic power was rising on the Greek mainland, a people we will soon get to know, the Mycenaeans. They may have simply taken advantage of a weakened Crete, invading and taking over what was left of the once great maritime empire. As the Minoan world faced its uncertain future, a journey far to the east, beyond the familiar landscapes of Mesopotamia and into the vast plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, would reveal a civilization that was in many ways the most enigmatic of them all. This was the world of the Indus Valley people, or the Harappan civilization, named for one of its great cities. Flourishing in the basins of the Indus River and the now vanished Ghaggar Hakra River, this culture was geographically the largest of the early Bronze Age societies, covering more territory than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And yet, for all its size and sophistication, it is the quietest of the ancient empires. They built cities of astonishing order and complexity, traded with faraway lands, and developed a beautiful, intricate script. But they left behind no grand royal monuments, no boastful inscriptions of kings, no epic tales of gods and warriors. Their story, for now, must be read in the silent ruins of their meticulously planned cities, a testament to a people who mastered the art of urban living and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, simply faded away. To walk through the excavated remains of a city like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa is a bewildering experience. Unlike the organic, almost haphazard sprawl of the Sumerian cities, or the labyrinthine complexity of Minoan Knossos, these cities were laid out with an almost obsessive degree of order. The streets run in a rigid grid pattern, straight and true, intersecting at perfect right angles, some wide enough to accommodate the passage of ox carts. The city was typically divided into two sections: a lower town where the bulk of the population lived and worked, and a raised, fortified citadel to the west, which likely housed public and administrative buildings. Even the construction materials were standardized. The baked bricks used to build the houses and city walls were, across a territory of hundreds of thousands of square miles, all made to the same precise 1.24 ratio of height to width to length. This uniformity speaks to a level of central planning or deeply ingrained cultural consensus that is without parallel in the ancient world. It's as if they were the first and last civilization to all agree on a universal building code. Perhaps most remarkable was their sophisticated management of water. Nearly every house in the lower town, no matter how small, had its own private bathroom and access to a well. Wastewater and sewage were not simply thrown into the streets, but were channeled away through a complex, city-wide network of covered drains that ran underneath the main thoroughfares. This concern for public sanitation is a feature of urban life that would largely disappear with the fall of Rome and not reemerge in most of the world for another 4,000 years. On the citadel of Mohenjo-Daro sits the most famous of these structures, the Great Bath. It is a large, rectangular tank, expertly constructed with waterproofed bricks and sealed with bitumen, with steps leading down into it from either end. It was likely used for public ritual bathing, a practice that remains central to religious life in India to this day, suggesting a deep continuity of cultural ideas. For all this order, however, there is a profound mystery at the heart of the Indus Valley culture. Who was in charge? In Egypt, the pharaoh's power is obvious in his pyramids and temples. In Mesopotamia, kings left behind statues and inscriptions listing their grand deeds. But in the Indus Valley, there are no such signs of elite authority. We have found no structures that can be definitively identified as a palace, no opulent royal tombs filled with gold, no large-scale statues of rulers. The largest buildings seem to be public structures, like the Great Bath or massive granaries. One of the most famous artifacts is a small, serene-looking statuette of a bearded man with a patterned robe, dubbed the Priest King by archaeologists, but in truth, we have no idea who he was or what role he played. This lack of evidence for a traditional monarchy has led to endless speculation. Was this a society ruled by a council of merchants or clan leaders? Was it a form of priestly theocracy where religious authority, rather than military might, maintained order? Or was their political structure something so different from our own models that we simply fail to recognize it? Compounding the mystery is their writing. Like the Minoans with their undeciphered linear A, the Indus Valley people also had a written language, and we cannot read a single word of it. It survives on thousands of small square seals, exquisitely carved from soapstone. Each seal typically features a beautifully rendered animal, an elephant, a tiger, a bull, or most commonly, a mythical one-horned creature that looks remarkably like a unicorn, along with a short line of elegant symbols. These seals were likely used to stamp impressions onto clay tags to mark ownership of goods, a sign of their extensive trade network, which reached as far as Mesopotamia. But the inscriptions are frustratingly brief, never more than a handful of characters long. Without a longer text, or a bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone, the script remains a beautiful but locked puzzle. Their name for themselves, the names of their leaders, their beliefs, their stories, all are lost to us. The end of this great silent civilization is as mysterious as its life. Around 1900 BCE, the cities began to decline. The meticulous urban grid started to break down. Houses were subdivided, and the sophisticated drainage systems fell into disrepair. Over several centuries, the population dwindled, and the great cities were gradually abandoned, the standardized bricks of their houses eventually buried by the shifting silts of the plain. There was no single, fiery destruction. The old theory of a violent invasion by chariot-riding Aryan tribes has been largely discredited by modern archaeology. Instead, the leading suspect is climate change. A gradual but persistent shift in the monsoon patterns may have weakened the rivers, drying up the Gagar Hakra and making agriculture in the core regions unsustainable. It was likely a slow, creeping collapse, a gradual unraveling of the complex trade and social systems that had maintained that incredible uniformity for so long until all that was left were the silent, orderly ruins of a world we can see, but not yet hear. As the great cities of the Indus Valley were slowly being reclaimed by the earth, another river valley far to the east was giving birth to a civilization whose relationship with bronze would be utterly unique. In the fertile and often turbulent basin of the Yellow River in northern China, a succession of powerful dynasties was laying the cultural and political foundations of a society that would endure into the modern day. Here, the story of the Bronze Age is not primarily about stronger plows or deadlier swords, though they certainly had those. Instead, it is a story of how molten metal became a bridge to the supernatural, a medium for speaking with ancestors and securing the favor of the gods. The bronze smiths of ancient China were not just artisans, they were high-tech priests, and the vessels they created were the most important ritual instruments in the kingdom. Before we can speak of the dynasty that perfected this art, the Shang, we must first address the shadow that lies behind them, the legend of the Xia. For millennia, Chinese historians, starting with the great Sima Qian, told of a first dynasty, the Xia, founded by a heroic sage king named Yu the Great, who tamed the floods of the Yellow River. For a long time, modern historians and archaeologists found no proof of this dynasty and dismissed it as a later myth, a foundational story created to legitimize subsequent rulers. But then, at a site called Erlitou, archaeologists uncovered a large Bronze Age city complete with a palace complex, workshops, and elite burials. It existed at the right time and in the right place to be the Sia. This discovery has sparked one of the great debates in Chinese history. Is Erlitou the capital of the legendary Xia dynasty, the first proof of its existence? Or is it simply a very early phase of the Shang culture that followed? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. The people of Erlitou did not leave us any texts to tell us what they called themselves. So for now, the Xia remain in a fascinating twilight zone between myth and history. What is undeniably real, however, is the dynasty that followed, the Shang. Rising to power around 1600 BCE, the Shang dynasty established a powerful state centered on a succession of capital cities, the most famous of which, Anyang, was discovered in the late 19th century. And it was in the tombs of the Shang kings at Anyang that the true genius of their culture was revealed. These tombs were filled with treasures, jade carvings, pottery, the remains of chariots, and the bodies of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of human sacrifices. But most spectacular of all were the bronzes. These were not simple bowls or cups. They were massive, intricately decorated ritual vessels, some weighing hundreds of pounds, each with a specific name and purpose. A ding for cooking food offerings, a gu for drinking wine, a zun in the shape of a fantastic animal. What truly set them apart was the technology used to make them. While smiths in the West were using the lost wax method, a technique good for curves and smooth shapes, the Shang had developed a far more complex piece mold casting process. They would create a highly detailed clay model of the vessel, then pack an outer layer of clay around it. This outer mold was then carefully cut away in sections, fired to become hard, and then precisely reassembled. Into this intricate, reconstructed mold, they poured the molten bronze. This technique allowed for a level of sharp, geometric detail and complex decoration that was simply unrivaled anywhere else in the world. The purpose of these magnificent objects was profoundly serious. For the Shang, the world was governed by a high god, Shangdi, and more importantly, by the spirits of the royal ancestors. The king was not just a political ruler, he was the chief intermediary, the one man who could communicate with these powerful spirits. His legitimacy and the security of the kingdom depended on keeping the ancestors happy. The rituals to do so were the central events of the state. In a grand temple ceremony, the king would offer food and wine to his ancestors, using these specific bronze vessels. As the food was heated in a ding, the steam would rise, carrying the essence of the offering up to the spirit world. The king would then drink ritual wine from a gu or a jiu to enter a state where he could receive the ancestors' wisdom. Power in Shang China was the ability to talk to the dead, and these bronzes were the sacred telephones that made the call possible. Owning these bronzes was the ultimate status symbol, the physical proof of one's connection to the divine and one's place in the lineage. We have another, even more direct window into the minds of the Shang kings, the oracle bones. When a king needed to make an important decision, whether to go to war, when to plant a crop, or even what was causing his toothache, he would consult his ancestors through divination. A ritual specialist would take a turtle plastron or an ox shoulder blade and carve a question onto it. He would then apply a heated bronze rod to the bone, causing it to crack. The diviner, and perhaps the king himself, would then interpret the shape of the cracks to find the ancestors' answer. Crucially for us, they would often inscribe the question, the answer, and sometimes even what later happened directly onto the bone. These inscriptions are the earliest confirmed body of Chinese writing, the direct ancestors of the characters used today. They are a treasure trove, giving us an intimate glimpse of the anxieties and priorities of a Bronze Age king. They tell a story of a world fraught with danger and uncertainty, a world that could only be navigated with constant guidance from the spirit realm, a guidance sought with the help of fire, bone, and the beautiful enigmatic bronze vessels that were the true source of a king's power. While the Shang kings of the Yellow River Valley were using their bronze vessels to gaze into the spirit world, the political landscape of the Near East was being violently reshaped by a new and formidable power. From the high, rugged plateau of Anatolia, in the heart of modern-day Turkey, a tough, pragmatic, and ambitious people were forging an empire that would soon challenge the might of both Egypt and Babylon. These were the Hittites, an Indo-European speaking people who established their capital, Hattusa, amidst a dramatic landscape of rocky crags and fortified it with cyclopean stone walls. They were not, perhaps, as elegant as the Minoans or as ancient as the Egyptians, but they were brilliant innovators, and they perfected a weapon of war that would dominate the battlefields of the Bronze Age: the light, horse-drawn chariot. The idea of a wheeled vehicle for battle was not new. The Sumerians, remember, had used heavy four-wheeled battle wagons pulled by onagers, which were essentially wild asses. These were slow, cumbersome platforms, good for intimidating infantry, but not for much else. They were the clumsy, primitive ancestors of the tank. Over the centuries, the technology slowly improved as horses were introduced for traction and spoked wheels replaced solid ones, making the vehicles lighter. But it was the Hittites who took this evolving technology and turned it into the decisive weapon of its age. They engineered a chariot that was a masterpiece of speed, stability, and power. By moving the axle from the back to the middle of the platform, they created a much more stable firing base that was less prone to tipping over on rough terrain. They reinforced the frame without adding excessive weight, allowing them to build a slightly larger and more robust vehicle than their rivals. The true genius of the Hittite war machine, however, was not just in its construction, but in how it was crewed and deployed. The chariot corps of their great rivals, the Egyptians, typically used a two-man crew, a driver and an archer. Their strategy was to use the chariot as a mobile missile platform, a fast-moving skirmisher that would race past enemy lines, peppering them with arrows before wheeling away to safety. It was a strategy of harassment. The Hittites had a different and much more terrifying idea. They added a third man to their larger chariots. Alongside the driver stood a warrior, not an archer, but a spearman, and a third man whose sole job was to carry a large shield to protect the other two. This seemingly small change transformed the chariot from a skirmishing vehicle into a heavy shock weapon, the ancient equivalent of cavalry or an armored personnel carrier. The Hittite strategy was to charge, full tilt, in massive squadrons directly into the flank or rear of an enemy infantry formation. The thunder of hundreds of hooves, the terrifying speed of the approach, and then the devastating impact of these three-man crews, stabbing down with long spears, was enough to shatter the morale and cohesion of even the most disciplined foot soldiers. Once a line was broken, the chariots could wheel around and pick off the fleeing, disorganized men. It was a brutal and terrifyingly effective form of blitzkrieg that made the Hittite army the most feared military force of its time. Away from the battlefield, Hittite society was also unique among the great powers. Their king was not considered a living god in the way the Egyptian pharaoh was. While certainly powerful, the Hittite great king was seen more as a first among equals, the chief priest and supreme commander, whose authority was at least partly checked by a council of nobles known as the Panku. This created a more feudal and contractual political system, one that, for a time, proved remarkably resilient. They were also masters of diplomacy, and their archives, discovered in the ruins of Hattusa, have given us a trove of cuneiform tablets containing the world's first detailed peace treaties and international correspondence. And hidden within these archives was another secret. The Hittites were among the very first people in the world to master the difficult art of smelting iron. For them, however, iron was not a common material. The process was difficult and expensive, and the resulting metal was treated as a rare luxury, more precious than gold or silver, reserved for ritual objects and diplomatic gifts to other kings. They were technically a Bronze Age kingdom with a secret Iron Age technology in their back pocket, a hint of the future that they themselves would not live to see. Armed with their revolutionary chariot corps and governed by a stable and pragmatic political system, the Hittites began to expand. They pushed out from their Anatolian heartland, conquering their neighbors and absorbing them into a growing empire. Their greatest military achievement came around 1595 BCE, when a Hittite army marched all the way down the Euphrates, broke through the defenses of the mighty city of Babylon, and sacked it, bringing the glorious dynasty of Hammurabi to a spectacular and ignominious end. This single act announced their arrival on the world stage in the most dramatic fashion possible. They were no longer a remote highland kingdom. They were a true superpower. This aggressive expansion southward into the rich lands of Syria and the Levant was putting them on a direct and unavoidable collision course with the other great superpower of the age, the Egyptian New Kingdom, which was in the midst of its own imperial expansion northward. The stage was being set for one of the greatest and most epic confrontations of the ancient world. While the Hittites and Egyptians were maneuvering their armies and their diplomats for control of the Near East, the Aegean world was undergoing a profound and violent transformation. The graceful, sea-kissed civilization of the Minoans, with its open palaces and vibrant frescoes, was giving way to a new, more somber and militaristic culture that had taken root on the rugged, mountainous mainland of Greece. These were the Mycenaeans, the first Greek-speaking people to step onto the stage of history. They were builders of immense fortresses, lovers of gold and glory, and practitioners of a fierce warrior code that would echo down the centuries, forming the bedrock for the epic tales of Achilles, Odysseus, and the great Trojan War. If the Minoans were the artists and merchants of the Aegean, the Mycenaeans were its soldiers and its kings. Their world was not centered on sprawling, unfortified towns, but on heavily defended citadels built on high, defensible hilltops. At places like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, these warrior kings raised walls of such staggering size that later Greeks, believing them impossible for mortals to have built, claimed they were the work of the mythical Cyclopes. These Cyclopean walls were made from massive, irregular limestone boulders, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar. To approach the main citadel of Mycenae, one had to pass through the famous Lion Gate, a monumental entranceway topped by a sculpture of two lionesses standing guard, a raw and powerful statement of royal authority. Within these walls lived the ruler, or Wanax, and his court, presiding over a kingdom from his great hall, or megaron, a large rectangular room with a central hearth, which would become the template for the classical Greek temple. These were not open, airy palaces like those on Crete. They were dark, imposing strongholds, built to withstand a siege, a clear reflection of the violent and competitive world they inhabited. The profoundly martial nature of Mycenaean society is most vividly displayed in the treasures they buried with their dead. In the 1870s, the pioneering but often reckless archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated a circle of deep shaft graves just inside the walls of Mycenae. What he found stunned the world. The graves were packed with an astonishing hoard of weapons and gold. There were dozens of bronze swords, some with pommels of ivory or crystal. There were bronze daggers exquisitely inlaid with gold and silver, depicting dynamic scenes of lion hunts and warfare. And covering the faces of the buried chieftains were golden death masks, hammered into the likeness of stern, bearded rulers. The most famous of these, Schliemann triumphantly and incorrectly declared, was the Mask of Agamemnon. While we now know it predates the likely era of the Trojan War by several centuries, it remains a haunting icon of this age. The face of a king whose power was measured in gold and displayed on the battlefield. Elsewhere, archaeologists have found the remains of their unique and intimidating armor, including the iconic boar's tusk helmet, a formidable piece of headgear painstakingly crafted from rows of curved tusks taken from dozens of hunted boars, a powerful symbol of a warrior's prowess. The rise of the Mycenaeans is inextricably linked to the decline of the Minoans, and the exact nature of their relationship is a subject of intense debate. Early Mycenaean art and culture were relatively simple, but they quickly absorbed and adapted the sophisticated style of their Cretan neighbors. Did they do this through peaceful trade and admiration, hiring Minoan artisans to work for them? Or was it a more hostile takeover? The evidence seems to suggest a progression from influence to outright dominance. By around 1450 BCE, many Minoan sites on Crete show signs of destruction, after which the Mycenaeans seem to be in control. It was at this time that a new script appears in the palace archives at Knossos and on tablets found at Mycenaean sites on the mainland. The script was clearly adapted from the Minoan Linear A, and for decades it remained just as mysterious. Scholars called it Linear B. The breakthrough came in 1952 when a brilliant young English architect and amateur linguist named Michael Ventris finally deciphered the script. He demonstrated against all expectations that the language of the Linear B tablets was not some unknown Minoan tongue, but a very archaic form of Greek. This was a monumental discovery. It proved that the rulers of these mighty citadels, the men behind the golden masks, were indeed the ancestors of the classical Greeks. The tablets themselves, however, were not filled with poetry or heroic tales. Much like the cuneiform records of Mesopotamia, they were the meticulous, and perhaps slightly boring, administrative records of a highly centralized palace bureaucracy. They list inventories of chariot wheels, allocations of bronze to smiths, offerings of perfumed oil to gods with familiar names like Poseidon and Zeus, and the dispositions of troops and rowers. They paint a picture of a tightly controlled economic system where every sheep and every jar of wine was accounted for by a legion of scribes. This, then, was the world that was later immortalized in the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The poems were composed hundreds of years after the Mycenaean civilization had collapsed, paced down through generations of oral bards. But they retain a dim, distorted, yet unmistakable memory of this lost Bronze Age grandeur. The powerful kings living in their mighty citadels, the lists of ships and armies, the descriptions of bronze armor and boar's tusk helmets, these are all authentic echoes of the Mycenaean age. Archaeology gives us the physical reality, the gold, the walls, the weapons, and the bureaucratic tablets. The epics give us the legend, the flawed, proud, and larger-than-life heroes who became the foundation of Western literature. The Mycenaeans were the historical substance behind the Homeric shadow. These great civilizations, the Hittites in their rocky citadels, the Mycenaeans in their golden halls, and the Egyptians on their eternal Nile, were not isolated actors. They were the superstars of a glittering, interconnected world, a complex web of trade, diplomacy, and warfare that spanned the entire eastern Mediterranean. We know this from their letters, the cuneiform tablets that speak of alliances and royal marriages, and from the trade goods found in the ruins of their cities. But in 1982, off a rocky point called Uluburun on the southern coast of Turkey, a local sponge diver stumbled upon something that would illuminate this lost world with more clarity than any written text ever could. A perfectly preserved time capsule of Bronze Age international trade, lying silently on the seabed for over 3,000 years. The Uluburun shipwreck is arguably the single most important discovery for understanding this period, a minutely detailed snapshot of the very system that held their world together. The discovery was an accident, a brief glimpse of what the diver at first called metal biscuits with ears, lying on a steep, rocky slope some 150 feet below the surface. Those biscuits were in fact copper ingots, and they were just the visible tip of an archaeological treasure beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Over the next decade, a team of underwater archaeologists undertook a painstaking excavation, one of the deepest and most complex of its kind ever attempted. Imagine the scene, a world of deep, silent blue, the only sounds the slow bubbling of the diver's own breath. Each day, for only a short and precious period of time before the dangers of decompression forced them to ascend, they worked with the delicate precision of surgeons. Every single artifact, from massive jars to tiny beads, was meticulously mapped, labeled, and carefully raised to the surface. It was slow, dangerous, and incredibly tedious work, but what emerged from the depths was a cargo so rich and so diverse that it was like finding the manifest of an entire Bronze Age international market in one place. The backbone of the cargo was the raw material that fueled the entire age. There were 10 tons of copper, cast in the distinctive shape of an ox hide, with 4 legs, or handles for easier carrying, the standard form for shipping the metal. Isotopic analysis later proved that this copper came from the mines on the island of Cyprus, confirming its role as the primary copper producer of the era. Alongside the copper was an entire ton of tin ingots, the other, far rarer ingredient, needed to make bronze. Remember that journey from Afghanistan? Here was the final product, piled high in the hold of a ship, ready to be turned into swords and helmets in some Aegean workshop. There were also nearly 170 cobalt blue and turquoise glass ingots, the earliest intact glass ingots ever found, which would have been melted down to make jewelry and decorative vessels. And packed into more than 100 Canaanite amphorae was the resin of the terebinth tree, a key ingredient for making fragrant incense and perfumes. The ship was also carrying logs of African blackwood, or ebony, a precious wood shipped up the Nile from Nubia, destined to become fine furniture in a Mycenaean palace. This was the bulk shipment, the industrial foundation of the Bronze Age world, all together in one hold. But it was the finished goods, the personal items and luxury products tucked in amongst the raw materials, that truly tell the story of the ship's international character. It was a floating catalog of the entire late Bronze Age world. There were beautiful Cypriot pots and jars. From the Canaanite or Syrian coast came elegant pendants and a trove of beads made from glass and agate. From Egypt, there was ivory, ostrich eggshells, and most remarkably, a solid gold scarab, a beetle-shaped seal bearing the cartouche of the famous and beautiful Queen Nefertiti, wife of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. This tiny object provided an invaluable clue for dating the shipwreck to the late 14th century BCE. And then there were the goods from the west. Piled in the hold were numerous pieces of fine Mycenaean pottery, the kind of stirrup jars and cups we saw from the mainland citadels. There were bronze spearheads and a sword of Mycenaean design. It seems the ship had either just come from a Mycenaean port or was heading to one, or perhaps even had Mycenaeans on board. So whose ship was it, and where was it going? This is the central mystery that the archaeologists continue to debate. The ship itself was built in a style common to the Levant, likely Canaanite. The stone anchors were of a type used in that region. The personal effects of the crew and merchants on board were a fascinating jumble. There were cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, a warrior's stone scepter from the Balkans, amber beads from the distant Baltic Sea, and weights and measures from at least 4 different cultures. It seems the ship's home port was likely on the Syrian or Canaanite coast. From there, it probably sailed to Cyprus to pick up its main cargo of copper, then began the treacherous journey west along the coast of Anatolia, trading at ports along the way. Its final destination was almost certainly a major hub in the Aegean, perhaps the island of Rhodes, or one of the great Mycenaean citadels. On that final leg of its journey, a sudden Mediterranean storm likely blew up, smashing the heavily laden ship against the cliffs of Uluburun and sending its priceless cargo and its crew to the bottom of the sea. Whether it was an official royal convoy carrying tribute between kings or a private merchant venture of staggering wealth, we may never know. But its silent, sunken treasure speaks more loudly than any text about the vibrant, interconnected, and truly globalized world of the late Bronze Age. The silent, sunken cargo of the Uluburan ship, with its tons of copper, tin, and ebony, represents the raw potential of the late Bronze Age. But it is only half the story. The other half takes place in the destination ports, in the noisy, sweltering workshops of royal artisans where that potential was transformed. For while bronze gave this age its name and its military might, it also gave it a new voice for artistic expression. The same metal that was cast into swords and spearheads could also be shaped into objects of sublime beauty and profound spiritual meaning. This was an age not just of warriors and merchants, but of master craftsmen who, with hands calloused by the hammer and the furnace, took the raw materials of the earth, bronze, gold, ivory, and glass, and spun them into the very language of power, status, and belief. Bronze itself, beyond its practical uses, became a favored medium for artists. We have seen how the smiths of Shang China poured their most advanced skills not into weapons, but into those magnificent ritual vessels. An artisan would spend weeks, perhaps months, carving the intricate clay sections of a piece mold, forming the stylized monster faces known as taoti, with their staring eyes and geometric horns, a design that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. For them, the beauty of the object was inseparable from its sacred function. The perfect execution of the cast was an act of reverence, a worthy conduit for speaking with the ancestral spirits. In the Aegean, bronze was used to capture the human form in motion. Small, dynamic figurines from Minoan Crete show us athletes in the middle of a bull leap, or slender women with arms upraised in prayer, their bodies imbued with a life and energy that feels startlingly modern. While most large-scale bronze statues from this era were later melted down for their valuable metal, the few that survive hint at a masterful tradition of sculpture that would lay the groundwork for the later triumphs of the classical Greeks. But the artistry of bronze also found its way into the most intimate aspects of daily life for the elite. In an Egyptian palace, a noblewoman might prepare for the day by gazing into a mirror made not of glass, but of a highly polished bronze disc, its handle often shaped into the figure of a goddess or a papyrus stalk. Her fine linen robes would be fastened at the shoulder with an elegant bronze pin or fibula. The very furniture of the wealthy was often decorated with bronze fittings, and their tables might be graced with bronze drinking cups and bowls. The metal was ubiquitous, a constant gleaming reminder of the wealth and technological mastery of the society that produced it. It was both a symbol of the state's power and a personal expression of one's place within it. Of course, for displaying the ultimate levels of wealth and divine favor, nothing could surpass gold. The Bronze Age was also a golden age. The goldsmiths of Egypt, supplied by the rich mines of Nubia, were masters of their craft. In the suffocating stillness of a royal tomb, like that of the boy king Tutankhamun, we can see the breathtaking full range of their skills. The king's solid gold innermost coffin and his iconic funerary mask are monuments of sheer, extravagant wealth, but they also display incredible artistry. Tiny, intricate details were created using techniques like granulation, where minuscule beads of gold are fused to a surface, and repoussé, where the metal is hammered from the reverse side to create a raised design. The effect is a dazzling, almost liquid radiance, a manufactured sunlight intended to guide the pharaoh through the darkness of the underworld. The warrior kings of Mycenae, as we have seen, were no less enamored with the metal. For them, gold was the very embodiment of glory. It was hammered into face masks to preserve a king's features for eternity. It was used to cover the pommels of their swords and the rims of their drinking cups, and on their famous inlaid daggers, the Mycenaean artists became painters, using slivers of gold, silver, and electrum to create dynamic, miniature scenes of warriors hunting lions, the figures so full of life they seem ready to leap from the bronze blade. And where gold was not used, other precious materials took its place. Ivory from the tusks of Syrian elephants or African elephants, whose tusks were traded down the Nile, was carved into delicate cosmetic boxes, combs, and exquisite statuettes of goddesses and noble ladies. The artists of the Bronze Age were masters of a global palette of materials, a direct result of the trade networks that crisscrossed their world. Behind all of these magnificent objects lies a quiet human mystery. Who were the artists that made them? Unlike in later periods, where the names of great masters were celebrated, the artisans of the Bronze Age are almost entirely anonymous. Were they slaves, working in royal workshops under the strict command of an overseer? Were they respected members of society, a kind of middle class whose skills were highly valued? Or were some of them famous, itinerant masters who traveled from court to court, their services sought by kings across the land? The remarkable similarity in artistic styles and techniques found in different kingdoms suggests that it was not just goods that were being traded, but ideas and people as well. An Egyptian craftsman might be sent to a Hittite court as part of a diplomatic gift. A Mycenaean warrior might bring back a Syrian ivory carver after a successful raid. These artists were the invisible threads in the international tapestry. Their hands shaped the objects we now see in museums, but their own stories, their own names, are lost to the silence of the past, their genius visible only in the enduring beauty of their work. While the master craftsmen of the Bronze Age gave their world its dazzling form and its sharp metallic edge, there was another class of specialist, quieter and less celebrated, who gave the era its memory and its voice. These were the scribes. In the cool, dusty archives of palaces and temples, they practiced a craft that was in its own way as complex and transformative as metallurgy. For if bronze was the hardware that allowed for the creation of cities and empires, writing was the essential software that made them run. It was the tool that organized armies, managed economies, codified laws, and in time allowed humans to record their deepest fears and grandest stories, sending their thoughts across the silent expanse of millennia. The story of the great kings and their empires is also the story of the patient, methodical men who sat before slabs of wet clay or rolls of papyrus, and with the tip of a sharpened reed gave order to the world. The path to becoming a scribe was not an easy one. In Mesopotamia, a young boy destined for the profession would be sent to the Aduba, the tablet house, for many years of grueling instruction. His days would be spent sitting in a courtyard, a lump of wet clay in his hands, learning to press the stylus to form the hundreds of complex, wedge-shaped signs of the cuneiform script. Early lessons were endless, tedious repetition, copying lists of signs, lists of objects, proverbs, and legal formulas over and over again until the movements were second nature. The discipline was notoriously harsh. Surviving school texts are filled with complaints from students about their long days and the frequent beatings they received for sloppy work or talking out of turn. But for those who persevered, the reward was a position of immense respect and influence. The scribe was the engine of the bureaucracy, the memory of the state. The primary function of writing, the very reason for its invention, was administration. Remember the Sumerian temple officials who needed to track bushels of grain? This fundamental need never went away. It only grew more complex. In the Babylonian Empire, scribes recorded every aspect of economic life on their durable clay tablets: marriage contracts, land sales, loan agreements with brutal interest rates, and meticulous court records. They gave us the great law codes, like that of Hammurabi, where legal principles were for the first time written down and applied systematically. In Egypt, scribes used two forms of their hieroglyphic script. For their monuments, the tombs, and temples, they used the beautiful formal hieroglyphs, a sacred carving meant to last for eternity. But for everyday work, they used a faster cursive script called hieratic, painting with a reed brush and ink onto rolls of papyrus. On these fragile documents, they recorded tax assessments, sent military dispatches, and calculated the rations of bread and beer needed for the workers building the pharaoh's tombs. And as we have seen, the Mycenaean scribes, with their linear B script, seem to exist for no other reason than to count, cataloging every chariot wheel, every bronze ingot, and every woolen tunic in the king's possession. As the Bronze Age world became more interconnected, writing became the language of international diplomacy. The most stunning evidence of this is a collection of tablets found in the ruins of the Egyptian city of Amarna. These are the royal archives of the pharaohs Akhenaten and his predecessor, and they contain the actual correspondence between the great powers of the 14th century BCE. The fascinating thing is that these letters, sent between Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylon, and smaller vassal states in the Levant, were all written in Akkadian cuneiform. This Mesopotamian script had become the lingua franca of the age, the universal language of diplomacy, much like English is today. On these tablets, we can read the words of the kings themselves. A Hittite king complains to the pharaoh about the quality of a shipment of gold, sniffing that it was not properly refined. The king of Babylon negotiates the marriage of his daughter to the pharaonic court. A petty king in Canaan begs for Egyptian troops to protect him from his rivals. It is a raw, unfiltered glimpse into a world of courtly protocol, fragile egos, and constant political maneuvering. A chess game played with letters sent by royal messenger across hundreds of miles of desert. Slowly, however, writing began to transcend its practical origins. It evolved from a tool for counting sheep into a medium for creating art. The scribes of Mesopotamia, in their off hours or as part of their advanced training, began to write down the ancient myths, hymns, and epic poems that had been passed down orally for generations. It is to them that we owe the preservation of the world's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its timeless story of a hero's quest for immortality and his profound discovery of what it means to be human. In Egypt, scribes composed wisdom literature. collections of moral advice and philosophical reflections on life, as well as beautiful hymns to the gods and ghost stories to entertain the court. Writing was becoming a way to explore the inner world, not just the outer one. And yet, for all its power, the ability to read and write remained the preserve of a tiny, elite minority. The sheer complexity of the cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems, with their hundreds of signs, ensured that literacy would never be widespread. The scribes were a specialized class, guardians of a secret knowledge. The great kings and warriors they served were often illiterate themselves, relying completely on these experts to read their treaties and write their histories. To be a scribe in the Bronze Age was to wield a quiet but immense power. You were the gatekeeper of information, the memory of the kingdom, and the voice that would shape how future generations remembered your age. The polite, formal, and often passive-aggressive diplomatic language of the cuneiform letters could only maintain the peace for so long. Eventually, the simmering rivalry between the two superpowers of the late Bronze Age, the Egyptian and Hittite empires, was destined to erupt into open war. The flashpoint was the control of Syria and the Levant, a rich corridor of trade that both empires considered their rightful sphere of influence. In the 5th year of his reign, around 1274 BCE, the young, ambitious, and supremely self-confident pharaoh of Egypt, Ramesses II, decided the time for talk was over. He assembled a colossal army with the goal of pushing the Hittites out of the region for good and reclaiming the glory of Egypt's imperial past. Marching south to meet him from his Anatolian heartland was the shrewd and experienced Hittite king Muwatalli II, at the head of his own vast multi-ethnic imperial force. Their two armies, the largest the world had yet seen, were on a collision course, destined to meet near a strategically vital city on the Orontes River, Kadesh. The battle that followed would become the best documented military engagement in ancient history. A clash of titans that perfectly showcases the terrifying power of the Bronze Age war machine. Ramesses' army was a magnificent sight, a force of some 20,000 infantry and over 2,000 chariots, organized into 4 grand divisions named after the chief gods of Egypt, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. As this immense force marched north into Syria, the Hittite king Muwatalli laid a masterful trap. He concealed his entire army, a force perhaps even larger than the Egyptians, behind the high earthen mound or tell of the city of Kadesh. He then dispatched 2 local nomads to be captured by the Egyptian scouts. Brought before the pharaoh, the 2 men spun a convincing tale. They claimed to be deserting their tribes to join the Egyptian cause, and told Ramesses exactly what he wanted to hear: that the Hittite army was terrified of the approaching pharaoh and had retreated 100 miles to the north. Ramesses, his youthful ego blinding him to caution, swallowed the bait completely. Believing the enemy to be far away, he broke one of the cardinal rules of military strategy. He allowed his army to become dangerously spread out. Anxious to reach Kadesh and secure it, he forged ahead with his lead division, the Amun, leaving the other 3 divisions strung out over miles of road behind him. As the Amun division arrived at the campsite northwest of Kadesh, tired and dusty from the march, Ramesses had no idea that Muwatalli's entire chariot corps, perhaps as many as 3,000 of those heavy 3-man war machines we spoke of, was waiting just on the other side of the river, hidden from view. The trap was sprung with devastating precision. As the second Egyptian division, the Ra was still on the march, completely unprepared for battle. The entire Hittite chariot force thundered across the Orontes River and smashed into its flank. The impact was catastrophic. The Ra division, caught completely by surprise, disintegrated into a panicked mob. The Hittite chariots plowed through their broken ranks and, without pausing, charged straight for the Egyptian camp, where Ramesses and the Amun division were hastily trying to form a defensive line. Within minutes, the camp was overrun. Ramesses found himself surrounded, cut off from the bulk of his army, his elite guards fighting desperately around him. The greatest pharaoh of the new kingdom was on the verge of a humiliating and total defeat. It is at this moment that history gives way to legend, crafted by Ramesses himself. In the official account, which he would later have carved in gigantic reliefs on the walls of half the temples in Egypt, the young pharaoh, abandoned by his cowardly troops, turned to his god, Amun. Divinely invigorated, he single-handedly mounted his chariot, charged the surrounding Hittite ranks, not once, but 6 times, and drove the enemy, thousands strong, into the river. It is one of the most breathtaking works of royal propaganda ever created. The more sober reality is probably a combination of Hittite error and sheer dumb luck. The Hittite chariot drivers, believing the battle won, broke formation and began to greedily loot the rich Egyptian camp, losing all discipline and momentum. At that very moment, a separate Egyptian relief force, the Narration, who had been traveling up the coast, arrived on the scene completely by chance from the Hittites' perspective and slammed into their exposed rear. This unexpected attack, combined with Ramesses' desperate but courageous countercharge, turned the tide of the battle, allowing the shattered Egyptian forces to regroup. The battle raged until sundown, a bloody, chaotic stalemate. The next day, the Egyptian infantry finally arrived in force, but the Hittite army, still in control of Kadesh, held a strong defensive position. Neither side could land a decisive blow. Ramesses, his army severely mauled and his strategic ambitions thwarted, had no choice but to withdraw and return to Egypt. Despite this, he promptly declared the Battle of Kadesh as the greatest victory in the history of the world. He spent the rest of his long reign plastering this heroic and highly edited version of the events onto every monument he built. The Hittites, for their part, also claimed victory in their own records. And in a strategic sense, they were right. They had stopped the Egyptian invasion cold and remained in firm control of Kadesh and the surrounding territory. So who really won? The truth is that it was a brutal, bloody draw, a chastening lesson for the young pharaoh, and a powerful demonstration that the two great empires were so evenly matched that neither could ever hope to fully destroy the other. The young pharaoh, Ramesses II, may have returned from Kadesh with his army battered and his strategic goals unmet, but he returned to a kingdom that was standing at the absolute zenith of its imperial power and wealth. The stalemate on the battlefield did little to diminish the reality on the ground. The Egyptian New Kingdom of the 13th century BCE was the richest and one of the most powerful states the world had ever known. This was not the cautious, consolidated kingdom of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs. This was a true empire, a cosmopolitan and expansionist power whose influence stretched from the gold mines of Nubia deep in the south to the vassal states of Syria in the north. The tribute from this vast territory, grain, timber, silver, exotic animals, and human captives, flowed into the royal treasury in a constant glittering stream. And underpinning it all was a seemingly inexhaustible supply of gold from the desert mines, a river of wealth that made the pharaoh the master banker of the entire eastern Mediterranean. This immense wealth transformed Egypt, and particularly its great capital city of Thebes, into a metropolis of unimaginable splendor. It was a golden age, where the traditional inward-looking culture of Egypt was now infused with international influences. Foreign merchants thronged the markets, foreign mercenaries served in the army, and foreign princesses, including Hittite royalty, entered the pharaoh's harem as part of diplomatic treaties. The palaces of the elite were filled with luxury goods from across the known world, fine Mycenaean pottery, fragrant Syrian oils, and lapis lazuli that had traveled all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan. This was the Egypt of the great imperial pharaohs, men like the warrior Thutmose III, who established the empire, the magnificent Amenhotep III, who presided over an era of unprecedented peace and artistic refinement, and now Ramesses II, the ultimate master of propaganda and monumental construction. The primary way a pharaoh displayed his power and piety was by building, and no one, before or since, built on the scale of Ramesses the Great. Fueled by the riches of empire, he unleashed a construction program of such breathtaking scope that it is almost impossible to comprehend. In the deep south, on the border of Nubia, he had his crowning achievement, the great temple of Abu Simbel, carved directly out of a mountain of living rock. 4 colossal, 65-foot-high statues of himself, seated in serene and implacable majesty, stare eternally eastward across the Nile. The entire temple was a calculated work of political propaganda, designed to awe and intimidate the rebellious Nubian tribes, a permanent reminder of the pharaoh's divine power. The engineering was so precise that twice a year, on the anniversaries of his birth and coronation, the rising sun's rays penetrate over 200 feet into the mountain's heart to illuminate the statues of the gods and of Ramses himself in the inner sanctuary. Further north, at the religious capital of Thebes, he added relentlessly to the great temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor. At Karnak, he completed the vast hypostyle hall, a stupendous man-made forest of 134 massive sandstone columns, so large that the tops of the central pillars are 70 feet high and could hold 100 men. To walk through it today is to feel utterly dwarfed, a humbling experience that was precisely the point. This was architecture as shock and awe, and Ramesses's ego was as vast as his building projects. Not content to simply commission new monuments, he frequently usurped the works of his predecessors, ordering his cartouche, his royal name, to be carved over theirs on countless statues and obelisks, effectively claiming their achievements as his own. This supremely confident traditional expression of pharaonic power under Ramesses was, however, the triumphant restoration of an order that had just a few decades earlier been radically and bizarrely overturned. In the middle of this golden age, a pharaoh named Akhenaten had instigated one of the strangest and most fascinating episodes in ancient history, a complete religious revolution. For reasons that are still a deep mystery, Akhenaten abandoned the entire pantheon of traditional Egyptian gods, Amun, Osiris, Isis, and all the rest. He declared that there was only one true God, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun itself. It was the world's first real experiment in monotheism. Akhenaten closed the old temples, redirecting their immense wealth to his new cult. He built a whole new capital city from scratch in the desert, called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, and fostered a strange, new, almost unnervingly realistic style of art. Was this a genuine spiritual revelation, or was it a calculated political move to shatter the immense power of the priests of the god Amun, who had become almost as wealthy as the pharaoh himself? We will likely never know. But his revolution did not survive him. After his death, his son, the young Tutankhamun, was pressured by the old guard to restore the traditional gods and abandon his father's city. Akhenaten's name was hacked from the monuments, and he was written out of history, remembered only as the heretic. The strange interlude was over. The glorious, polytheistic, monument-building tradition returned with a vengeance under Rameses, who re-established a vision of pharaonic power so potent and enduring that it seemed destined to last forever. In the courts of the great Egyptian and Hittite kings, the Mycenaean Greeks were known as the Ahiyawa, a troublesome and increasingly powerful kingdom from across the sea. But this is not the name by which we remember them. We remember them by the names from the epic poems, the Achaeans, the Danaians, the Argives. We remember them as the heroes of the most famous story to emerge from the entire Bronze Age, a tale of a stolen queen, a decade-long war, a wooden horse, and the tragic, fiery destruction of the greatest city in the East. The story of the Trojan War, as told by the poet Homer, is so powerful and so foundational to Western culture that it has often overshadowed the historical reality of the age. For centuries, it was assumed to be pure myth, but as we look closer at the dust of a Turkish mound and the faint script on Hittite clay tablets, a fascinating question emerges. Is there a kernel of historical truth, a real Bronze Age war, hidden within the beautiful poetry of the epic? The search for the historical Troy begins and ends with one man, a brilliant, obsessive, and often maddeningly unscientific German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann. Having made a fortune as a merchant, Schliemann retired to spend his money chasing his childhood dream, to prove that the cities described by Homer were real. In 1871, guided by his copy of the Iliad, he began digging into a large mound in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, which local tradition had long associated with Troy. What he found there was not one city, but a whole stack of them, 9 major layers of settlement, built one on top of the other over 3,000 years. With a furious energy, Schliemann blasted a great trench through the center of the mound, destroying a great deal of valuable evidence in the process. He eventually uncovered a cache of spectacular gold and bronze artifacts, which he dramatically named Priam's treasure, and declared to the world that he had found the Troy of the epics. We now know that Schliemann was wrong in his specifics. His methods were crude, and the treasure he found belonged to a city 1,000 years older than the one Homer described. But he was magnificently right in his central conviction. He proved that Hisarlik was the site of a major, fortified Bronze Age city, in exactly the right location to be Troy. Later, more careful archaeologists like Wilhelm Dürpfeld and Karl Blegen were able to patiently unpick the complicated layers of the site. They identified the layer known as Troy at 6 as the most likely candidate for the legendary city. This was a grand and wealthy place, with formidable sloping limestone walls and high defensive towers, a city that grew rich by controlling the trade that passed through the nearby Dardanelles Strait. This magnificent city, however, appears to have been destroyed not by war, but by a powerful earthquake around 1250 BCE. Its walls toppled and burned. In its ruins, the survivors quickly built a new, shabbier city known as Troy Setsivius. This city was more crowded, with houses crammed inside the walls, and it shows clear and unambiguous evidence of a violent end. Around 1180 BCE, it was attacked, looted, and burned to the ground by human enemies. The archaeology, then, gives us two possible scenarios: a great, wealthy city destroyed by an act of nature, or its poorer successor destroyed by an act of war. For a long time, this was as far as the evidence could take us. The ruins proved a city existed and was destroyed, but they couldn't tell us who destroyed it or why. The breakthrough came from a completely different source: the archives of the Hittite Empire, which we remember were the great rivals of the Egyptians. On the clay tablets from their capital of Hattusa, Hittite scribes mentioned on several occasions a powerful kingdom in western Anatolia, which they called Wilusa. For years, the name was just a curiosity until linguists made a compelling connection. If you account for the way ancient languages shift and are transcribed, Wilusa is an almost perfect linguistic match for the early Greek name for Troy, W-Itzilios. The city of the Iliad was apparently known to the Hittites. The texts go even further. They speak of a great and often troublesome king across the sea, the king of the Ahiyawa. As we've noted, most scholars now agree that this is the Hittite name for the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks. In one particularly tantalizing letter, a Hittite king writes to the king of the Ahiyawa about a previous dispute over the city of Wilusa, a matter which seems to have involved military intervention. Other texts mention a specific king of Wilusa named Alexandru, a name that is strikingly similar to Alexandros, which is the other name for the Trojan prince Paris in the Iliad. Here, in the dry diplomatic correspondence of a neutral third party, we seem to have the key elements of the story. A great king of the Mycenaeans, involved in a political and military conflict with the city of Troy. So what is the answer to the Trojan War question? There was almost certainly no 10-year siege over a beautiful queen, no pantheon of gods walking the battlefield. But the evidence strongly suggests that the epic is a poetic echo of a real historical conflict. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Ahiyawa, were an expansionist and occasionally piratical power. The city of Troy, or Wilusa, was a wealthy and strategic prize. It is highly likely that at some point in the late Bronze Age, a coalition of Mycenaean warriors mounted a great raid, or a series of raids against Troy, and that this campaign ended in the city's violent destruction. Centuries later, after the Bronze Age world had collapsed and writing had been lost, oral bards, the poets who preceded Homer, wove the dim memory of this last great military adventure of the Mycenaean kings into a magnificent and tragic song, a story far more compelling than any simple trade dispute. The myth is not history, but it seems to have been born from it. The last great songs of the Mycenaean heroes had been sung, and the echoes of their final, perhaps Pyrrhic victory at Troy faded into the past. In the grand palaces of Hattusa, Thebes, and Mycenae, the kings and their scribes recorded the movements of their armies and the exchange of diplomatic gifts, secure in the belief that their glittering, interconnected world was the pinnacle of civilization, a permanent state of affairs. They worried about the ambitions of rival kings, the loyalty of their vassals, and the proper performance of religious rites. But they failed to notice a more subtle and far more dangerous enemy, one they could not fight with a chariot or appease with a treaty. For high above their heads, the patterns of the sky were changing. The reliable rains that had sustained their fields for centuries were beginning to fail, and a deep, prolonged, and calamitous drought was creeping across the entire eastern Mediterranean, slowly drying out the very foundations upon which their magnificent world was built. For a long time, the idea of a climate-driven collapse was just a theory, a convenient explanation for a complex event. But in recent decades, an entirely new kind of archaeology, the archaeology of the environment, has provided stunning and sobering evidence. Scientists can now drill deep into the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes and seas, pulling up long core samples of sediment. These cores are like natural archives, containing layers of pollen, seeds, and chemical isotopes that can be read like a book, telling the story of the climate year by year, century by century. And the story they tell of the late Bronze Age is stark. Across the entire region, from Greece and Anatolia to Syria and the Levant, the pollen record shows a dramatic shift beginning around 1250 BCE. The pollen from forest trees like oak and pine and from cultivated crops like wheat and barley begins to dwindle. In its place, the pollen from tough, drought-resistant shrubs and grasses begins to dominate. The message is clear. The forests were shrinking, the fields were failing, and the landscape was becoming drier and more barren. Other data, from the growth rings of ancient trees to the chemical composition of cave stalagmites, all point to the same grim conclusion. This was not just a few bad years. It was a severe, multi-generational mega-drought, a climatic event of a scale not seen in thousands of years, and it gripped the heartlands of the Bronze Age world for the better part of 3 centuries. This scientific data gives us the what, but the ancient texts give us the human cost of that change: famine. The entire palatial economy of the Bronze Age was built on agricultural surplus. The farmers grew more grain than they needed, and this surplus was collected by the central administration to feed the king, his soldiers, his priests, and all the artisans who made the magnificent objects we so admire. When the rains failed, the surplus vanished. When the rains failed for a decade, and then 2, the system began to starve. In the Hittite capital of Hattusa, the clay tablets from the final years of the empire are no longer concerned with grand diplomacy. They are filled with desperation. The Hittite queen, Puduhepa, writes a pleading letter to the pharaoh Ramesses II. "I have no grain in my lands," she states plainly. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, records a naval battle fought simply to secure a shipment of grain from a vassal state. It was a war fought for a loaf of bread. The evidence is even more harrowing from the great Syrian port city of Ugarit. One of the last letters from its king speaks of a famine so severe that it is as if the mouths of his enemies have opened to devour his people. He writes that he is forced to send his own fleet in search of food. An even more famous and poignant tablet was found in a kiln, where it was being fired to make it permanent when the city was destroyed. It is a desperate letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, reporting that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast and lamenting, "My troops are in the Hittite country, and my ships are in the land of Lycia." Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. The famine had forced him to send his defenders away in search of grain, leaving his wealthy, beautiful city a ripe and undefended target. Even Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, whose agriculture was fed by the reliable Nile flood rather than direct rainfall, felt the effects of this regional crisis. While the Nile's flow remained relatively stable, the collapse of its trading partners created immense instability. Rameses II's successor, the pharaoh Merneptah, boasts on a great inscription that he kept the land of the Hittites alive by sending them massive shipments of grain. This was not an act of charity. It was a calculated political move to prop up a rival empire, a recognition that the collapse of the Hittites would create a dangerous power vacuum on Egypt's border. It shows how deeply the crisis was biting that the mighty Hittites, the equals of Egypt at Kadesh, were now dependent on their old enemy for their very survival. The intricate web of trade and diplomacy that had been the glory of the Bronze Age was now becoming its greatest vulnerability. With hunger gnawing at the heart of every kingdom, the entire system became brittle. Desperate, hungry people began to abandon their barren fields. Societies were coming untethered, and the stage was being set for a period of chaos, migration, and destruction unlike any the world had ever seen. The great, interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was a finely tuned machine, a marvel of complexity built upon the predictable rhythms of agriculture and the steady flow of trade. But the mega drought had thrown a wrench into its gears. With the fields turning to dust and the royal granaries standing empty, the intricate bonds of treaty and tribute began to fray. Hunger is a powerful force, one that respects no border and acknowledges no king. As the foundations of their societies crumbled, people throughout the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean began to do the only thing they could. They left. They abandoned their parched villages and their failing cities, packed their families and their few belongings into ox carts and open boats, and set out in a great, chaotic wave of migration. They were searching for new lands, for food, for survival. And as they moved, this tide of desperate humanity would become the human agent of the collapse, a destructive force that the Egyptians would come to know by a single, ominous name, the Sea Peoples. Our most vivid and terrifying portrait of these enigmatic invaders comes from the grand mortuary temple of the pharaoh Ramesses III at Medinet Habu in Egypt. Remember the scene we glimpsed at the very beginning of our story? Here it is, carved in square acres of stone for all eternity. Ramesses III, who ruled about a century after Ramesses the Great, faced the full fury of the storm. On his temple walls, he depicted his great battles against this mysterious confederation, fought on both land and sea. The reliefs are a chaotic jumble of images. We see naval battles in the Nile Delta, the Egyptian ships grappling with the high-prowed vessels of the invaders, the air thick with arrows, the water filled with the dead and drowning. We see the Sea People's warriors, distinctive in their feathered headdresses or horned helmets, fighting with a desperate ferocity. And most tellingly, on the land battle reliefs, we see that they were not alone. Behind the lines of their warriors are heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts, piled high not with plunder, but with women and children. This was the crucial detail. This was not a simple military invasion or a pirate raid. This was a people on the move, a nation in search of a new home, burning the old world down as they went. The Egyptian inscriptions that accompany these reliefs are filled with a tone of existential dread. Rameses III declares, "The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms." He lists the casualties of their advance. Their league was the Peliset, Chaker, Shekelesh, Denian, and Weshesh, lands united. He claims that they had already destroyed the Hittite Empire, laid waste to Cyprus, and burned the cities of Syria to the ground before they arrived at the borders of Egypt. For a long time, this was seen as standard pharaonic boasting, an exaggeration of the threat to make his victory seem more glorious. But modern archaeology has proven that, if anything, Rameses was understating the case. Across the entire eastern Mediterranean, the archaeological record from this period shows a horizon of fiery destruction. The great Hittite capital of Hattusa was violently destroyed and abandoned forever. The rich port of Ugarit was burned to the ground, its king's final desperate letters left unread in a kiln. The mighty Mycenaean palaces at Pylos and Mycenae were put to the torch, their bureaucratic records baked hard in the flames that consumed them. An entire world was going up in smoke. But who exactly were these people? This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. They were not a single, unified nation, but a loose confederation of different groups, likely brought together by shared desperation. The names the Egyptians gave them offer tantalizing but frustrating clues. The Peliset are almost universally identified with the Philistines, who would later settle on the coast of Canaan and become the great rivals of the early Israelites. The Shurden, who are depicted as both enemies and mercenaries for the Egyptians, might be connected to the island of Sardinia. The Luca were likely from the Lycian coast of Anatolia. And most intriguingly, some scholars have suggested that the Ekwesh could be a form of the name Achaeans, the very same Mycenaean Greeks who had fought at Troy. It is a chilling thought that the victors of one great destruction might have become the agents of the next, their own kingdoms collapsing behind them and forcing them out onto the sea. The evidence of the ox carts, filled with families, strongly suggests that the core of the sea peoples were victims themselves, entire societies uprooted by the famine and chaos of the age. They were displaced Anatolians, homeless Aegeans, and perhaps even starving peasants from the collapsing Mycenaean kingdoms, all moving together in a great wave. But they were likely joined by others, opportunistic pirates, professional mercenaries whose employers could no longer pay them, and rebels from within the great empires themselves. The sea peoples were not so much a specific group of people as they were a symptom of the collapse itself. As the great empires weakened, they could no longer police the seas or secure their borders, which allowed raiders to operate freely. As the famine spread, it created millions of refugees. It was a domino effect, a feedback loop of chaos, where each collapse created more instability, and that instability triggered the next collapse. They were the product of a dying world, and they would become its executioners. The great wave of migrating peoples, of desperate warriors, and displaced families did not just lap at the edges of the great empires. It crashed directly into their heartlands, shattering the structures that had seemed so permanent and so powerful. The first of the great imperial dominoes to fall was the one that had stood as Egypt's chief rival for over a century, the mighty Hittite Empire. We remember them as the masters of the three-man chariot, the pragmatic rulers from their rock-hewn capital of Hattusa. But their empire, for all its military might, was a complex and brittle structure. Its Anatolian heartland was less fertile than Egypt or Mesopotamia, and therefore more vulnerable to drought. The desperate letters begging for grain in the empire's final years tell a story of a state already hollowed out by famine, its strength sapped from within, leaving it dangerously exposed to the final, fatal blow. The end came with shocking speed and finality. Sometime around 1180 BCE, the great capital city of Hattusa, which had stood for 500 years, was violently destroyed. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous. The vast stone walls were breached, and the city within was subjected to a systematic and overwhelming fire. The great temples, the royal palaces, and the administrative buildings were all consumed by an inferno of such intensity that it baked hard the thousands of clay tablets in the royal archives, preserving them for posterity, even as it destroyed the civilization that wrote them. After the fire, the city was abandoned, never to be reoccupied. The silence that fell over its blackened ruins was the silence of an entire empire vanishing from history. But who was responsible for this catastrophic destruction? This remains a tantalizing mystery. The last Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, recorded victories against seaborne enemies off the coast of Cyprus, which suggests the sea peoples were certainly a major threat. It is easy to imagine a wave of these invaders pushing inland and sacking the capital. Yet Hattusa is located deep in the rugged Anatolian plateau, far from the sea. Other suspects have been proposed. For centuries, the Hittites had been plagued by a semi-nomadic, warlike people from the mountains to the north known as the Casca. It is entirely possible that the Casca, seeing the empire weakened by famine and chaos, seized their moment and swept down to deliver the killing blow. A third possibility is that the end came not from without, but from within. A starving populace, pushed to the brink of desperation, may have risen up against the ruling class that could no longer feed them, leading to a catastrophic civil war that tore the empire apart and left its capital a smoldering ruin. Whatever the cause, the effect was absolute. The highly centralized Hittite state simply ceased to exist, splintering into a collection of smaller, so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms that clung to the embers of their former glory. The first of the great superpowers was gone. At the same time, a similar drama of collapse was playing out across the Aegean Sea in the world of the Mycenaean Greeks. Their civilization, as we have seen, was a network of fortified palace citadels, each controlling its surrounding territory. This system, too, was highly centralized and bureaucratic, utterly dependent on agricultural surplus and the international trade that brought them their essential bronze. The drought and the disruption of the sea lanes hit them with a terrible force. The evidence from their final days, preserved on the linear B tablets from the palace of Pylos is chilling. The scribes record frantic preparations for a coastal defense, mentioning watchers on the coast and the requisition of bronze from temples to be melted down for weapons. The tablets speak of dispatching rowers to the coast and making last-minute religious offerings. They are the final hurried notes of an administration bracing for an attack that it knew was coming. And come it did. One by one, the great citadels fell. The palace at Pylos was violently burned, and the fire that destroyed it was the very thing that baked and preserved its clay tablets for archaeologists to find. The great fortress of Mycenae itself, with its lion gate and its cyclopean walls, was attacked and its palace destroyed. Tiryns, Gla, and other centers across mainland Greece all show similar signs of violent destruction around the same time. The sophisticated, literate, palace-based civilization of the Mycenaean warrior kings was wiped from the face of the earth. As with the Hittites, the identity of the destroyers is a matter of intense debate. Were they victims of the same sea peoples that were ravaging the rest of the Mediterranean? It is certainly possible. Or did the system collapse from within? Some historians argue that as resources grew scarce, the intense rivalry between the different Mycenaean kingdoms erupted into a devastating series of internal wars, a war of all against all that shattered their own civilization. Another theory points to a widespread social uprising, with the oppressed and starving peasants rising up to overthrow the warrior aristocracy in their hilltop citadels. And an older tradition, preserved in later Greek legends, speaks of a Dorian invasion, an influx of less advanced Greek-speaking tribes from the north who swept away the remnants of the Mycenaean world. The most likely answer is that it was a toxic combination of all these pressures. Weakened by famine, their trade routes severed, the Mycenaean kingdoms were vulnerable to whatever final shock, be it invasion, civil war, or rebellion, pushed their world over the brink, extinguishing the lights of their civilization and plunging Greece into a dark age that would last for centuries. The fires that had consumed Hattusa and Mycenae cast a long and ominous shadow over the eastern Mediterranean. With the great empires of the Anatolians and the Achaeans now just smoldering ruins, only one of the old superpowers was left standing. Egypt, ancient, wealthy, and resilient, was now the last bastion of the Bronze Age order, a lonely island of civilization in a sea of chaos. But the great wave of destruction, that migratory storm of the sea peoples, had not yet broken. Having swallowed the rest of the civilized world, it now gathered its full and final fury and turned towards the rich, fertile lands of the Nile Delta. The pharaoh on the throne, Ramesses III, knew that this was not a war for territory or for tribute. It was a war for survival, and he would be the final defender of his kingdom against a world-ending tide. The first great assault came by land. The confederation of the sea peoples, moving with their families in their slow ox carts, advanced south through the now shattered remnants of the Hittite Empire in Syria, following the coastline down towards the borders of Egypt. Ramesses III, a capable and energetic commander, did not wait for them to arrive. He marshaled the full might of the Egyptian army, its ranks of disciplined archers, its steadfast spearmen, and its elite chariot corps, and marched out to confront them on the very edge of his empire, likely somewhere in southern Lebanon or Canaan. The battle that followed, as depicted on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, was a clash of two different worlds. On one side, the ordered professional army of a centralized state, fighting with time-honored tactics. On the other, a desperate, migrating horde of warriors, fighting with the ferocity of men who had nothing to lose and were trying to carve out a new home for their families. Rameses won a decisive victory, halting the overland invasion in its tracks. The reliefs show the Egyptian chariots crashing into the enemy lines, the pharaoh himself firing his bow from his chariot, and the Sea People's warriors being slain or led away in captivity. He had secured his land border, but the greater threat was yet to come. Blocked on land, the Sea Peoples now gathered their fleets for a direct amphibious assault on the mouth of the Nile itself. They intended to force their way into the heart of Egypt from the sea, a strategy no foreign enemy had ever successfully attempted. Rameses, anticipating this move, prepared a brilliant and brutal trap. He knew the Egyptian ships, primarily designed for the calm waters of the Nile, were heavier and less maneuverable than the high-prowed sailing ships of the Sea Peoples, which were built for the open Mediterranean. A battle on the open sea would be a dangerous gamble, so he decided to let the enemy come to him, luring their entire fleet into the winding, narrow channels of the Nile Delta. This was the key to his strategy. Once inside these confined waterways, the Sea People's ships, which relied on the wind and their single large sails, would have been at a severe disadvantage, unable to turn or maneuver effectively. Rameses had lined the banks of the river with legions of archers hidden amongst the reeds. As the enemy fleet sailed into the bottleneck, the trap was sprung. Egyptian ships, powered by rowers, suddenly emerged to block the entrance, cutting off any chance of retreat. The battle, as depicted in the stunningly detailed reliefs, was less a naval engagement and more a methodical, one-sided slaughter. From the riverbanks, the Egyptian archers unleashed a relentless storm of arrows, firing point-blank into the crowded decks of the trapped ships. The inscriptions describe the scene with grim satisfaction. A hedge of arrows enclosed them. With the enemy's sailors and soldiers pinned down by this barrage, the Egyptian marine forces, on their more stable oar-powered vessels, moved in for the kill. They used grappling hooks to snag the enemy ships, pulling them close so that Egyptian soldiers could board them or simply capsize them, tipping their crews into the water to be speared or drowned. The victory was absolute and overwhelming. The reliefs show a chaotic scene of capsized ships, drowning men, and Egyptian soldiers hacking at the helpless survivors. Rameses III had utterly annihilated the Sea People's fleet and saved his country from invasion. In the aftermath, his soldiers gathered the severed hands of the dead enemies to present to the scribes for an official body count, a grim piece of Bronze Age accounting. The pharaoh had his victory, and he made sure every visitor to his temple would know it for eternity. He had faced the storm that had broken every other kingdom, and he had won. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, a triumph that came at a terrible cost. The decades of warfare against the Sea Peoples and rival Libyan tribes had completely exhausted the Egyptian treasury. The effort to repel the invaders had forced Egypt to abandon the last vestiges of its empire in Canaan and Syria, and many of the captured Sea Peoples, particularly the Peliset and the Tieker, were settled as vassals in those very coastal cities, creating a powerful and often troublesome new entity, the Philistines, right on Egypt's doorstep. Rameses III had saved Egypt, but the country he saved was diminished, impoverished, and isolated. He had won the final bloody battle of the Light Bronze Age, but he had also presided over its funeral. The old, interconnected world was gone, and a new, poorer, and more fragmented age was dawning. Rameses III had saved Egypt, but he could not save the world that Egypt had once been a part of. His victory was a lonely one, a last stand on the shores of a dying civilization. When the smoke from the last burning city cleared and the final war cries of the sea peoples faded, the silence that descended upon the eastern Mediterranean was not the silence of peace, but the hollow, echoing silence of a profound and catastrophic loss. The intricate web of trade and diplomacy, the complex tapestry of cultures that had been woven together over 2 millennia, had been violently and irrevocably torn apart. The Late Bronze Age was over. In its place, a new, poorer, simpler, and darker age had begun. We call it a Dark Age, not because the people were evil, but because the era itself is dark to us, a time when the great palaces fell silent, the scribes lost their craft, and the lights of civilization, for a time, went out. The most immediate and devastating consequence of the collapse was the severing of the great trade routes. Remember the incredible cargo of the Uluburan shipwreck, with its copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ebony from Africa, and amber from the Baltic, all in a single hold. That world of interconnected commerce was gone. The sea lanes, once policed by the great empires, were now infested with pirates and raiders. The great port cities like Ugarit were heaps of rubble. The complex supply chains that brought the essential ingredients of bronze together were shattered. With no reliable supply of tin, the very technological foundation of the age crumbled. Bronze production plummeted, and what little was made was of poor quality. The material that had given the age its name became a scarce and precious commodity. An entire economic system built on the free movement of goods and materials across thousands of miles had suffered a total system crash. With the collapse of the palaces came the most tragic loss of all, the disappearance of writing. In the Mycenaean world, the loss was absolute and breathtakingly swift. The linear B script, as we saw, was a complex and cumbersome syllabary, a specialized tool used exclusively by a small class of scribes for the sole purpose of palace administration. It was never a script used for poetry, for personal letters, or for public inscriptions. Its existence was tied completely to the palace bureaucracy. When the palaces burned, the bureaucracy vanished. The scribes had no one to work for, their schools had no one to supply, and their craft had no function in the small, impoverished villages that replaced the great kingdoms. Within a single generation, the knowledge of linear B was simply gone. It was not adapted or simplified. It was completely forgotten. For the next 400 years, Greece would be a land without writing, its people illiterate, their history preserved only in the fallible and fluid memory of oral bards. A similar fate befell the other great literate cultures. In Anatolia, the Hittite cuneiform tradition, with its centuries of accumulated knowledge, vanished with the destruction of Hattusa. In the Levant, many of the coastal cities lost the art of writing for a time. Only in Egypt, which had survived the initial shock, and in parts of Mesopotamia did the old scribal traditions cling to life. But even here, they were in a state of decline. This profound loss of literacy meant that the complex knowledge of the Bronze Age, its engineering, its medicine, its astronomy, its literature, was largely lost. The world became a place of forgetting. Across the land, the great urban centers withered and died. People abandoned the dangerous ruins of the great cities and fled to smaller, more defensible hilltop villages. Archaeology reveals a catastrophic drop in population, perhaps as high as 90% in some regions of Greece. The world became emptier, and with the disappearance of the wealthy palace elites who had commissioned their work, the master artists and craftsmen vanished as well. The production of luxury goods, of fine gold work, intricate ivory carvings, and beautiful frescoes ceased entirely. Even basic crafts like pottery declined dramatically. The elegant, beautifully painted Mycenaean vases were replaced by crude, simple, and undecorated pots. The grand skill of building in cut stone was lost. No more cyclopean walls, no more monumental temples, no more grand tombs were built. The world became a smaller, simpler, and less beautiful place. Life for the survivors was a daily struggle for subsistence in small, isolated communities. Their horizons shrunk to the next valley, their memories of the age of their grandfathers, an age of golden palaces and godlike kings, fading into the realm of myth and legend. The great international experiment of the Bronze Age was over, a failed state on a global scale. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, as the survivors picked through the rubble of their once great cities, a single haunting question must have echoed through the generations. Why? Why had their magnificent world, with its godlike kings, its golden treasures, and its mighty citadels, fallen apart so completely and so quickly? For decades, historians and archaeologists have debated this very question, proposing single causes for the catastrophe. Some pointed to the invading sea peoples, others to the evidence of earthquakes, and still others to the widespread drought. But the truth, most scholars now believe, is not found in any single cause, but in the fatal interaction of all of them. The end of the Bronze Age was not a simple event. It was a process, a cascade of failures that overwhelmed a civilization that had become perhaps too complex for its own good. It was a perfect storm, what is now understood as a systemic collapse. To understand the collapse, we must first remember the nature of the system itself. The late Bronze Age world, as we have seen, was a marvel of interconnectedness and specialization. It was a world where a Mycenaean king's power depended on his ability to acquire tin that had been mined in the mountains of Afghanistan and copper smelted on the island of Cyprus. It was a world where a Hittite army was fed with grain grown in the fields of Syria, and where Egyptian artisans carved with ebony that had been felled deep in Africa. The entire structure was managed by a tiny, hyper-specialized class of scribes using complex writing systems to keep meticulous track of every last resource. The whole civilization was like a vast, intricate, and beautiful machine, with each part, from the farmer in his field to the sailor on his ship, playing a crucial and well-defined role. For centuries, this machine ran beautifully, generating unprecedented wealth and stability. But its very complexity was its hidden, fatal flaw. The first great shock to this system was an external one, the one factor that no king or priest could control: the climate. As we discussed, the prolonged megadrought that began in the 13th century BCE was the initial stressor. It attacked the very foundation of the machine, its agricultural power source. With harvests failing year after year, the surplus of food that had fed the entire non-farming population, the soldiers, the artisans, the bureaucrats, began to vanish. The machine was being starved of its fuel, and every part of it began to slow down and seize up. This initial crisis then triggered a cascade of other interconnected failures. The famine, as we saw, created widespread social unrest and set vast numbers of people, the sea peoples, in motion, looking for new lands to settle. This mass migration and the piracy and warfare that came with it had a devastating effect on the second pillar of the system: international trade. The sea lanes became unsafe, the merchant ships stopped sailing, and the great supply chains that moved metals and other essential goods were severed. Now, not only was the machine starving for food, but its crucial components, tin and copper, were no longer being delivered. This is the point at which the system's complexity became a deadly liability. The ruling elites in their palaces, whose power and legitimacy were built on their ability to control these prestige goods and to field bronze-equipped armies, suddenly found their authority crumbling. They could no longer supply their smiths with metal, which meant they could not properly equip their soldiers. They could no longer feed their people, which destroyed the social contract that kept them in power. The central nodes of the entire network, the palaces at Mycenae, Hattusa, and elsewhere, began to fail. Weakened by famine and resource shortages, they became easy targets, both for external raiders like the Sea Peoples and for internal rebellions from their own desperate and hungry populations. Imagine the Bronze Age world as a magnificent, impossibly tall tower built of Jenga blocks. Each block is a different part of the system: the chariot corps, the scribal schools, the tin trade, the palace bureaucracy. The tower is a masterpiece of balance and engineering. The drought was like a player carefully removing several key blocks from the very bottom of the tower. The structure didn't fall right away, but it became critically unstable, wobbling precariously. Then, the Sea Peoples and the internal rebellions came along and gave that wobbly tower a decisive shove. The result was not a neat toppling. It was a complete and total disintegration, the entire structure exploding into a heap of disconnected, meaningless blocks. This is why the collapse was so profound. When the central palaces were destroyed, the specialized knowledge they supported, literacy, monumental architecture, advanced artistry, had nowhere to go and simply vanished. The system didn't just break, it shattered into 1,000 pieces, leaving behind a simpler, poorer, and much darker world. The great, glittering machine of the Bronze Age had shattered, but life, as it always does, went on. In the ruins of the old world, amidst the silent palaces and the abandoned cities, the survivors began to piece together a new existence. The collapse of the great centralized empires created a profound power vacuum, particularly in the lands of Canaan and Syria, the very crossroads that had once been crushed between the ambitions of the Hittites and the Egyptians. With their imperial overlords now gone, this region became a fertile ground for new identities and new political experiments to take root. Smaller, more localized, and more resilient groups, many of whom had been mere footnotes in the Bronze Age, now emerged from the ashes to become the master builders of the new era that was dawning. Among the most powerful and influential of these successor peoples were the direct descendants of the chaos itself, the Philistines. We have already met them under a different name, the Paliset, one of the most prominent groups in the Sea Peoples Confederation that had battled with Rameses III. After their defeat, the pharaoh settled these formidable warriors and their families along the southern coastal plain of Canaan, perhaps as a kind of buffer state to protect Egypt's border. Here they established a powerful league of 5 cities: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, known as the Pentapolis. The Philistines brought with them the memories of their origins in the Aegean world. Their early pottery is a locally made version of late Mycenaean styles, and their architecture and religious practices show clear links to their former homes across the sea. They were outsiders, a new and dynamic element in the cultural landscape of Canaan, and they also brought with them a mastery of the new iron technology, which for a time gave them a significant military advantage over their neighbors. For centuries, these powerful and well-organized city-states would dominate the coastal region, becoming the great antagonists of another new people that was coalescing in the hills to their east. While the Philistines were establishing themselves in the lowlands, the collapse of Egyptian control in the highlands of Canaan created the space for another identity to emerge, one whose story would arguably have a greater impact on the world than any Bronze Age empire, the Israelites. The very first mention of Israel outside of the Bible comes from a victory stele of the pharaoh Merneptah, dated to just before the Great Collapse, which mentions that Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. At that point, they were just one of many tribal groups in the Canaanite hills. But in the chaotic centuries that followed, they consolidated into a tribal confederation and then a monarchy. The historical origins of this people, however, are one of the most intensely debated mysteries in all of ancient history. The traditional account from the biblical book of Joshua tells of a swift and total military conquest of Canaan by Israelite tribes who had come from Egypt. Modern archaeology, however, has found little evidence to support this narrative of a single, unified invasion. Many of the cities mentioned as being destroyed were either already in ruins or show no signs of conquest at that time. This has led scholars to propose other models. The peaceful infiltration theory suggests that the early Israelites were semi-nomadic pastoralists from the desert fringes who, over a long period, gradually migrated into the less populated hill country and settled down. A third and very influential hypothesis is the social revolt model. This theory proposes that the Israelites were not outsiders at all, but were indigenous Canaanite peasants. During the chaos of the collapse, these people fled the oppressive, hierarchical city-states of the coastal plains and lowlands and escaped into the hills. There they forged a new, revolutionary identity based on a more egalitarian tribal society and the worship of a single, liberating national god, Yahweh. It is possible, of course, that the truth is a complex mixture of all these things. A core group with an origin story in Egypt may have been joined by migrating pastoralists and disaffected Canaanite peasants, all coalescing into the people who would become Israel. This pattern of new groups emerging in the power vacuum was repeated across the former imperial territories. In Syria, nomadic, Semitic-speaking peoples known as the Aramaeans settled down and formed a mosaic of powerful new kingdoms, the most famous of which would be centered on the city of Damascus. Their language, Aramaic, would prove so successful that it would eventually replace Akkadian cuneiform and become the new lingua franca of the entire Near East for the next 1,000 years. And in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, the remnants of the Hittite Empire clung to life, forming a collection of so-called Neo-Hittite city-states. They preserved the Hittite language, art, and religious traditions for several more centuries, a living echo of the great Bronze Age empire from which they had sprung. The old, monolithic world was gone, replaced by a patchwork of smaller, scrappier, and more dynamic kingdoms, each fighting for its place in the sun in a world that was being rebuilt from the ground up. In the fragmented, post-collapse world, the old ways were broken. For the new kingdoms of the Philistines, the Israelites, and the Neo-Hittites, the intricate supply chain that had provided the ingredients for bronze was a distant memory. The sea lanes were dangerous, and the great empires that had organized the tin trade were gone. To build a new future, they needed a new material, one that was not dependent on the ghosts of a dead civilization. The answer was all around them, locked away in the common reddish-brown rocks and boggy marshes of their own lands. It was iron. This metal was not a recent discovery. The Hittites, remember, had known the secret of smelting it for centuries. But in the age of bronze, iron was a curiosity, a difficult and expensive prestige metal, rarer than gold. Now, in the wreckage of that old world, necessity would turn this curiosity into the very foundation of the next. The great mystery of the Iron Age is why it took so long to begin. Iron is the fourth most common element in the Earth's crust, while tin, the essential ingredient for good bronze, is incredibly rare. On the surface, it seems like an obvious choice. But the challenge of iron was never its availability. It was its chemistry. The technological leaps from copper and bronze to iron was immense. Bronze is a relatively friendly metal. Its components melt at temperatures that could be achieved in a well-built charcoal furnace, and the resulting liquid alloy could be poured easily into a mold to create a perfect axe head or sword. Iron, however, is far more stubborn. Its melting point is nearly 500 degrees higher than that of copper, a temperature far beyond the capabilities of any Bronze Age kiln. You simply could not melt and cast it. To work iron, a completely different and far more laborious process was required. A smith would build a furnace, a simple clay chimney, and fill it with layers of iron ore and charcoal. After hours of stoking the fire with bellows to get it as hot as possible, the iron in the ore would not melt, but would soften into a spongy, porous lump filled with impurities and slag. This was called a bloom. The smith would then have to drag this glowing, incandescent mass from the furnace and begin the back-breaking work of repeatedly heating it in a forge and hammering it on an anvil. Each blow would squeeze out more of the molten slag and slowly consolidate the metal into a solid bar of what we call wrought iron. It was an art form that required immense strength and skill. And here was the crucial secret. This early wrought iron, produced with so much effort, was not actually a very good metal. In fact, a well-made tin bronze sword was significantly harder and held a much better edge than a simple iron one. This is why the Hittites treated it as a novelty. As long as the tin trade was flowing and high-quality bronze was readily available, there was simply no incentive to switch to a more difficult and inferior material for tools and weapons. The collapse, however, changed the equation completely. Suddenly, tin was unobtainable. The choice was no longer between good bronze and bad iron, but between bad iron and no metal at all. It was this crisis, this technological vacuum, that forced the blacksmiths of the New Age to truly master the secrets of this difficult metal. Through generations of trial and error, likely in places like Cyprus and the Levant, where the old traditions were disrupted but not entirely lost, these smiths unlocked the three-part process that could turn soft iron into hard steel. The first secret was carburization. By heating the iron bloom in the charcoal-rich forge for a long time, the surface of the metal would absorb carbon from the fuel, transforming it into a primitive form of steel. The second step was quenching. Plunging the red-hot carbonized iron into a trough of cold water would rapidly cool it, locking its crystalline structure into a very hard but also very brittle state. The final and most subtle step was tempering. The brittle, quenched blade would be gently reheated to a much lower temperature, which would relieve the internal stresses and remove the brittleness while still preserving most of the hardness. This three-step recipe, carburization, quenching, and tempering, was the great technological breakthrough that truly began the Iron Age. A properly steel-edged sword was not just a replacement for bronze, it was a vast improvement. This new technology had profound social and political consequences. Bronze had been an aristocratic metal. Its rare ingredients were controlled by the great kings and their palace economies. Only the elite could afford to equip their armies with bronze. Iron, by contrast, was a democratic metal. The ore was available almost anywhere. Any small local kingdom or even a village chieftain with access to a forest for charcoal and a skilled blacksmith could, for the first time, afford to equip his own fighting force. Power became decentralized. The Philistines, with their early mastery of ironworking, were able to dominate their neighbors. The small Israelite kingdom in the hills could field an army to challenge them. The age of vast chariot-based empires was over. The future would belong to the smaller, scrappier kingdoms and the citizen soldiers who wielded the hard, sharp edge of the new iron world. The new world, forged from the democratic and resilient power of iron, was a practical one, a world of small kingdoms and hard-working farmers. But in the quiet hours, around the hearths of humble villages, the old world had not vanished entirely. It lived on in the one place it could not be destroyed, in human memory. For the illiterate people of the new Dark Age, the preceding era of bronze was not a period of history to be studied from texts and artifacts. It was a lost golden age, a time of myth and legend passed down through the hypnotic rhythms of oral poetry and the hushed telling of ancestral stories. The trauma of the collapse was so absolute that it created a profound break in the continuity of history, transforming the real, complex world of the Bronze Age into the mythic age of heroes that lay at the dawn of time. Nowhere is this process of remembering more clear than in Greece. As the bards who were the ancestors of Homer traveled from village to village in the poor, fragmented landscape of the Greek Dark Age, they sang of a world that would have been almost unimaginable to their listeners. They sang of great kings like Agamemnon, who could command 1,000 ships. They sang of mighty walled citadels like Mycenae and Troy, of warriors clad from head to toe in gleaming bronze, and of palaces filled with treasures of gold and ivory. To their Iron Age audience, these were not just stories, they were echoes from a half-forgotten grander time, a time when men were stronger, their deeds were greater, and the gods themselves walked the earth and took part in the affairs of mortals. The later Greek poet Hesiod, writing near the end of the Dark Age, formalized this folk memory. He described the history of the world in a sequence of metallic ages: a golden age of peace, a silver age, and then a bronze age, populated by a terrible and strong race of men who sprang from ash trees, loved only war, and were ultimately destroyed by their own hands. He saw his own time correctly as a lesser Iron Age, a period of toil and sorrow. The memory of the metal that had defined the lost civilization was preserved, embedded in the very structure of their myths. A similar echo can be heard in the traditions of the ancient Near East, particularly in the stories that would eventually be woven into the Hebrew Bible. The towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia, forgotten for a millennium, may have lived on in the cautionary tale of the Tower of Babel, a story about arrogant men building a tower to the heavens in a great city on a plain. The memory of the New Kingdom's imperial power in Canaan is preserved in the stories of Egypt as the great monolithic oppressor, a land of monumental buildings, and an all-powerful pharaoh from which the Israelites had to escape. And the tales of the Philistines, the great rivals of early Israel, often describe their champions, like Goliath of Gath, as giants clad in impressive bronze armor and wielding enormous bronze weapons. This may be a distant but authentic memory of the well-equipped sea peoples whose Mycenaean-style gear and organized warfare would have seemed terrifying and overwhelming to the more simply equipped tribes of the Israelite hill country. The lost world of bronze became the grand, heroic, and sometimes terrifying backdrop against which the peoples of the Iron Age defined themselves. Its greatness served to magnify their own achievements, and its catastrophic fall served as a potent moral lesson about the dangers of pride and the fragility of civilization. The real history of intricate trade routes, of diplomatic correspondence on clay tablets, and of the slow, patient work of artisans was forgotten. In its place, a grander and simpler story was told, a story of heroes and monsters, of divine wrath and a world consumed by a great war, a final glorious adventure before the darkness fell. And so, our long story of the Bronze Age comes to a quiet close. The age itself now sleeps, buried deep under the earth. Its magnificent bronze swords and golden masks rest in the silent, still darkness of the tomb. Its thousands of clay tablets, filled with the accounts of kings and merchants, lie unread in the ruins of forgotten cities. The world we have walked through tonight, a world of bustling ports and grand palaces, of daring sailors and meticulous scribes, has vanished as completely as a dream upon waking. But its echoes are still with us in the foundational myths of our civilizations and in the simple, enduring fact that it was the first time our world truly became one. And now, as these echoes fade, may you find your own rest to be deep and peaceful.